So I'm going to say I'm here with one of my favorite people, Ryan Turnipseed. Now, Ryan Turnipseed can be found on YouTube. He's got a very popular YouTube channel. He's also on Twitter at Turnip Merchant. And also, I did not mention this before in some other clips that we have with people, but there's this website where you can find a lot of the people that we have spoken to on this show. Is a site called findmyfriends.net. That's friends, FRENS.net. So if you'd like to learn more from Ryan Turnipseed, find him on there. It's got links to everyone, and a lot of guys in our scene will have pages on there. You can find links to all their stuff, one-stop shop. So just to start, I want to say thank you very much, Mr. Turnipseed, for showing up.
And thank you very much for having me. I hate to correct someone just at all, really. Typically, I try to keep that private, but this is material. I have today been suspended from Twitter for saying that murder is a capital crime that carries with it a capital punishment. Yeah, so
back that up, too, because what was it that you had said?
So, okay. I say suspended. It might be a 7-day thing. They're after me now, but basically is what it is. But Swalwell, I think he's a representative from California. He put out this scare ad that basically just had a completely fictitious, never happened before scene where a mother, her husband, and their 2 children are at a dinner table, and cops come to arrest them because she has had an abortion in the past. I don't know what family they went to film where the mother had an abortion and they are still together living a wholesome family life, but apparently it exists in their minds. And I just gently corrected him, and he put out a tweet that said Republicans want to arrest people that have had an abortion, and or conservatives or something like that. And I sort of tongue-in-cheek, but still very much genuinely replied, no, not arrest, execute. Because for anyone that takes the principle that abortion is murder seriously, murder is a capital crime, and it carries with it the same punishments as any other capital crime, which is death. So it shouldn't be.
It's funny that they live in such an interesting future. Remember when Trump was elected and we were supposed to see like giant fascist zeppelins, and then all the white guys get like a new type of hat to wear? We never got that.
I was told that I was going to receive Klan hoods in the mail, but I never got one.
According to every woman, I was supposed to get a Bible in the shape of a gun and a gun in the shape of a Bible. So, what the fuck?
I mean, all of their predictions just stop, or they never really come true. I was told nukes were going to fly whenever Trump called Kim Jong-un fat and short. I was told that the Klan was literally going to retake over America like it's 1922 as soon as Trump announced a border ban, and we didn't even get the immigration cuts, let alone the free racist membership or anything. So
yeah, and now we're getting World War III maybe now, and everyone is like, okay, sure, I could be nuked.
We got the worst of all possible timelines, which is we're getting screwed over, but it's not even fun. It's boring screwed over.
I remember, I think I might have mentioned this on the show, but there was a tweet, and it was by one of the mainstream guys. It might have been George Stephanopoulos or something. I don't really know their names, but he was saying, he was responding to a tweet, and the tweet was in response to another tweet, and it was about a nuclear war, and the response was, who cares? He's like, what the hell? Huh? All these younger generations aren't scared of nuclear war. And then the excuses were that, they don't have an emotional connection to the duck and cover, go under your desk thing that was drilled into everyone's heads. And then also, I'm kind of stepping back, or it's a spiritual malaise where people just don't care if they're nuked, which is worse, actually. It's not, the solution isn't more brainwashing, because I think we're almost at our peak of brainwashing for every single issue.
Analyze that for a second. If you're going to tell someone we are going to wipe out every single civilization on the face of this earth, you don't need a sort of 80s cartoon-style propaganda film telling you that that's bad and that you would need to hide under your desk. Most people could readily extrapolate that, God, that's terrible on a moral level, on just a disgust level, on a fear level. Like, this is terrible. The youth, and I talk about this a little bit on my channel. The first few videos I put out was talking about the young generations, Generation Z in particular. They have no connection to a past society at all whatsoever, but for the most part, and they have really no connection to the society around them now. So, if you hear people on the news, which also for them, for their entire life has been wrong 95% of the time, saying we could get nuked, regardless of whether they're serious or not, or the probability, it's just not going to carry any weight with Generation Z, because there's no foundation in anything. They've been forsaken, but they also don't care that they've been forsaken. So, civilization ending wasn't matter to them.
It is true, and I think the Gen Z aspect of that's very curious, because I'm a older millennial. I'm in my 30s, so
Right.
there's certain things that I recall that, and my wife is around a few years younger than me, so there's things that I recall that she doesn't recall. She doesn't really remember 9/11, for example, but that might also be that women are less political. And I'd love to see a shakeout of how many guys versus girls were glued to the screen on 9/11. I'm not saying any way or the other. That's an interesting graph to me, but this idea that after 9/11, and I'd explain this to Gen Z because it sounds silly when I outline it, but I'm like, they used to have like a thermometer, like a height, a level that they would have on the news of the risk of the next terror attack, and went from green at the lowest level, level 0, up until red at the top, and that's level 5, and would go up and down based on how likely a new terrorist attack was, and it never went below orange. So every single day for years, it was just like, it's going to happen now, soon, tomorrow, probably. And then that never really went away. And if you are a Gen Z, you're in a society where everyone is telling you since birth that democracy is almost over. Democracy dies in darkness, and it is dark, so it's dying. Like, this could all be over yesterday. So you've got a Gen Z person has never known ideological peacetime.
Well, and this is going to be really strange, and I'm not here to preach my Zoomer rhetoric, but for the vast majority, the Zoomers you see online talking about politics are not representative. They are a niche group, similar to a hobby or something like that. The vast majority of Zoomers probably don't really even know what a democracy is practically. They just know it's the thing that the news says is good. We know it's moral because our history teachers and political teachers told us it's good, and it's what the United States is, whether it actually is or not. The vast majority of them don't care. They're mostly apathetic towards all of this, and that's why whenever you see youth opinions on the latest political event or the latest political candidate, they're going to skew in favor of whichever one offers them the most direct and transparent benefit. We'll cancel debt, or we'll just hand you money for free. They're drawn towards that because they don't consider consequences. They don't consider long-term effects. They don't have ideologies or thought processes or first principles. They just take what they can, or they go for whichever candidate is the most entertaining. So that's what the majority do.
Yeah, and so you are a Zoomer, and what I found interesting was with millennials especially, maybe Gen X people, but millennials especially, was always kind of calling what the Gen Z was going to do next. Like, Gen Z were simultaneously the most based generation ever that was going to save civilization, and also the most gay and trans and this and that at the same time. And so it's hard for me, being an old guy, a spiritual boomer, to see what actually is going on, because there's conflicting data. So I guess to start, what is your assessment of you kind of gave one there, but is there any other assessments you can make about life as a Zoomer?
So they basically, elite theory, like any other theory that hits any sort of audience larger than 500 people, has basically been beaten to death and memed into these overly simplistic points. But Zoomers are like most other population groups in that they can only work with what they have in front of them. So if you have people that control media, political power, businesses, and all this other stuff, they're going to go along with whatever that is in some way, shape, or form, even if they oppose it. just because you can't. It's unless you're just some naturally talented philosopher or thinker. It's hard to just come up with something on the spot for why you should actually oppose something. And most Zoomers don't even have like a connection to church or something, or an intact family. So they don't even get that basic introduction. They're at the whims of businesses, video games, media, politicians, and the public schools. So whenever you look at data about the Zoomers, even if the stuff is genuine, it's because that group of Zoomers is influenced by what is most around them. That's just like, you're basically just asking what's the culture of the area these Zoomers are from. That being said, the majority of the Zoomers are likely to identify as like bisexual or homosexual or stuff like that, just because it's trendy. It's what all the companies push. It gets you a special social status, and it's somewhat of an identity. If you go to high schools or stuff like that, there's no cliques anymore. It's not like there's jocks and cheerleaders that will like be in their distinct groups. It's all kind of atomized. They're more likely to be on their phones. It's very socially different or weird to just approach someone on the street and talk to them, things like that.
That is curious because, again, this will age me. I get it, but when I would say to my wife, like, I remember not having a cell phone, period, in high school. Now, part of that was because we didn't have money for a cell phone, but also not a lot of other people did either. And this is why, I've got a child on the way, and even prior to the child being on the way, there was always a thought like, I don't know how to raise a kid in this society. I don't know, like, cyberbullying is kind of a meme, but I'm like, but really though?
That's an advantage, because if you know more about the society, the more you'll wish you didn't. So if you just raise your children as if they are living in like, 1820 or something,
Nice.
They will turn out leagues better than anyone else around them that is being raised in this culture, even tangentially. So
now, I want to put something your way, because this is something I was thinking about earlier today, and I talked to people about this because for people who don't know, the listeners will laugh because I mention this all the time, but for new listeners, I work in marketing. And so I'm very interested in media consumption and information transfer and things like that. And one thing I noticed was I would always get hard on boomers. That sounded weird. Let me rephrase that. Sometimes I would be hard on boomers because I would say, man, a boomer will believe anything they see on TV. TV is their ultimate authority, and they will devalue anything that is not on TV. And we would laugh at that's the infomercial. That's the random guy in a lab coat saying, I'm a doctor, wink. But then I look at millennials and also Zoomers, where we've known for a long time that these generations are unplugging from television. They do not read the newspapers, the numbers. Anyone could find these numbers that bears that out. And they're even walking.
Radio is also being skewed. Yeah.
Yes. Now that presents opportunities for people. Just if people are getting into marketing, this presents opportunities for getting older generations who have lots and lots of money. So if you want to go after people who got lots of money, you're going to want to spend money on radio and newspaper shit. But the point being that they are also distancing themselves from Facebook. But what they are choosing, for a while, I was interested because they were choosing more insular and more hard to reach groups. That was kind of like the Clubhouse thing. But over the past, TikTok, and it started with Snapchat, really, it's the developmental mutation of the feed. That's what we call it. So in short, it is the excitement about an algorithm. So we like the idea of content tailored to us and delivered to us in an unending feed. That's essentially what TikTok is. It is the death of searching for information, which, once you only miss it when it's gone. So the idea that I no longer search for information, I no longer feel I need to vet information. I leave the vetting up to this algorithm, which I assume is unbiased. And not to say that all Zoomers do this or all millennials do this, but there is a generational trend towards something I think is worse than just trusting the TV. So what do you think about that?
It's exactly correct. And I was about to bring up sort of like the detrimental effects of something like Snapchat or Instagram or TikTok and all these other things where it's so something. I'll just preface what I'm about to say. Most Zoomers, the vast majority of them, do not use something like Twitter or Telegram or something more long form, just because that's boring. It has text on the screen. There's not moving, flashing colors and sounds. The dopamine receptors aren't getting their quotas, so you don't use things like Twitter or Telegram or anything else where people might write. You go to Snapchat, Instagram, and TikTok, where you either see very colorful pictures and filters, or TikTok's especially insidious because they have managed to find a way to skillfully combine outrage, with all the different things that will go viral on there, with pornography, where you usually have like a half-naked woman dancing in the background to keep attention. So it's psychological warfare, to use a term, just because they've combined two of the most extreme mimetic potentials in a human: outrage and pornography, and they've just unleashed it on a generation, basically in isolation. I don't know many. I know very few millennials, rather, and few Gen Xers that use TikTok. It's almost just Zoomers, from what I see. So. It's terrifying.
Which isn't to say Zoomers are dumb, which is not what I like to say. And that's what's so interesting about it. When I mention this, is that there's what I think is, no one's fooled by it, but there's a deep, deep cynicism that, just to connect it to our previous point about, being okay with being nuked. But it's this idea, if I go up to someone and talk about TikTok and I say, it's mining your data, right? They'll say, yes. I say, and it's delivering brain candy. Like it's like everything you just said. It's the worst type of content developed at lightning speeds, and it's supposed to be addictive. It's designed by scientists to be addictive. They'll say yes, and I'll say, and it's owned by China, and China doesn't like you, and it would probably have an interest in giving you content that weakens you socially. And they'll say yes. And I would say, I don't know what else I can say now. That's what's so, I don't know how to jailbreak anyone from the total apathy about this sort of thing.
Yeah, I remember back in 2020, late 2019, whenever TikTok was starting to become popular, at least among the people that I knew. And I remember I was like, okay, this is basically like dopamine pornography. You're not earning this. It's going to harm you socially. It's mining your data, and it's owned by people that hate you. And the Zoomer response every single time, this is what kind of clued me into there's something wrong here. At least something that I could articulate instead of just feel. Was they would all just say, I don't care. And that's because a Zoomer fundamentally acts on impulse and stimulus, and not based off of consequences and benefits and anything in the future. So TikTok does have all of these absolutely terrible downsides that you and I would look at either explicitly or just kind of in the spur of the moment, and we would say, I'm not going to use this, it's god-awful. A Zoomer would say, I enjoy using this, I'm going to use it, I don't care that it's pornographic and outrage porn and that people hate me, the people that hate me own it. I'm just going to use it because it makes me feel good, basically.
Yeah, and to give a bit of credit to Zoomers here, from when I hear them say things like that, I would say what they're really saying is, I don't see the difference between this and politics. Everything in society is so devalued and has such a crisis of legitimacy. This openly corrupt thing is about the same as a hiddenly corrupt thing. I might have made up a word, but there it is, hiddenly. I don't know.
So I know what you're saying, and that is something that can be expressed there, but I don't think that's the intention of most of the people using it. I think it's more just that they don't, unless you go to a religious school, or you have an intact, you're one of the rare people, one of the rare Zoomers that have an intact family that you can still talk to your grandparents, and there's not a massive amount of divorces and family drama. You don't really get taught to plan for the future and analyze costs and benefits and evaluate your first principles. You just kind of get told to do what you want to do. It's the ultimate. What's the British Nietzschean pagan thelema, something like that.
Yeah, I think so.
It's do as you will, is basically what the Zoomers are taught.
I think it's the lemma. It's like the Crowley thing, right?
Yeah. So it's basically just that, but with absolutely no connection to it. They've just independently reached this conclusion, I would reckon, of, it feels good, so do it. That's the whole thing that underlies a ton of, there's these outrageous charts that people show that's like, was it like 40% of Gen Z identifies as LGBT or whatnot? And it's basically just people saying, I'm bisexual. It's something they don't have to prove or do anything, and it gives them social status. It doesn't matter if it's sinful or immoral or if it's, high time preference or something like that. They basically just it's what they want to do. It has these short-term benefits. They're very easy to see, and I don't consider the long-term consequences, so I'm just going to put myself in this protected group and to skew anything that might be traditional. They don't think that. It's just what they do.
That's true, and that is something that has affected millennials. That's affected me in some way because I've been in my current career path for quite a long time in marketing and in Canada. Imagine, and so it's an industry that has always been traditionally pretty woke, progressive, whatever you want to call it. It's very, I'd say it's got pretty close to gender parity, maybe even majority women. But when you have a job application, let's say I'm trying to get into a big agency, especially an agency in a big urban center. This was like the first industry I think of that was openly asking people like 10 years ago on applications whether or not you were white, and openly
Right.
saying we want to hire non-white people or some other minority. And so, it occurred to myself and a lot of my colleagues, like, should we just say we're trans? Like, just check the box. No way they can grill me on that. I can just show up and say, yeah, but if you actually ask me any more questions, that's a hate crime. So, but then you consider it, but I'm like, yeah, I don't want to do it. It'd be living in too grim of a lie. And maybe I'm the sucker for not doing it, but this has been going on in my life for a while.
Right, and you and I have a sense of morality, very, very close. Not identical, but very close, probably with a 95% overlap, to where we have a conscience or an obligation not to just lie like that and take advantage of such a immoral worldly system. But the T on that LGBT alphabet soup is literally the emperor and his new clothes, because you're not allowed to question it. As you just said, if you question if someone really is that way, it's a hate crime. If you ask any details, it's a hate crime. If you even so much as display any modicum of skepticism, it is a hate crime. So when someone tells you, I'm trans, especially in a professional setting, you just have to go along with it, much like the emperor tells you he has new clothes, and only the most competent and qualified people can see them. Well, you don't want to be outed as incompetent and unqualified, so you don't say that he has no clothes. You don't inquire.
Here's a trick people can do at home. If you want to mess with a office busybody, this will take a bit of setup to do. Probably you need to have a fake identity to do it. But if you went in saying that I'm trans, and the woman who wants to collect minority friends like Pokemon comes up to you, it's like, I heard you're trans. And like, well, what do you mean? Am trans? Are you saying something trans is something you can be? Like, just if you ask enough incredulous questions, I think you'll cause them to short circuit. Like, just make them question, like, does trans even exist? Like, are you saying trans is something someone just is? No, I don't think so. You didn't think. That's right. And just get mad. Just get mad at them in a trans-like fashion. And I'm not even saying anything will happen. Just see where that takes you. Maybe it's a promotion. Probably not jail. But I think there's a big dollar sign at the end of that rainbow.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have a moral conscience preventing you from doing this, I mean, there's only benefit here, because you are unlucky. Yeah, quite literally, this is just a case of probability. You're unlucky, and you realize that the law is just meant to harm you, the person that is outside of this weird sort of immoral blob. You can't take advantage of this because it's designed to harm you, and they don't give a damn what the written law says. So, one of those two things will happen.
Now, I got a question for you, and we touched on something briefly just a minute ago about Zoomers, but people broadly not having a connection to any sort of church, any sort of traditional, foundational stuff. Now, this will sound like a big question, and I'm going to try and grope my way through this.
Yeah.
But one of the criticisms made against young people, oftentimes who start off perhaps atheistic or agnostic, but get into religion later, typically Catholicism, but also Eastern Orthodox is a popular one now.
Mm-hmm.
They will say that, these young people are getting into it for the wrong reasons, or it's a LARP. They use that word a lot, LARP.
Okay.
And my policy is, I'm like, well, maybe I can't speak to anyone's intentions, really. I can't speak to whatever their journey is, but I'm also like, if that were the case, would that be the worst thing in the world? Now, A, do you think that's true or a big problem? And B, do you agree with that outlook?
Right. So, typically, I very rarely, very sparingly use the word LARP. Just like the only times I use it are when I'm basically describing something that is just fantasy. And I mean that in the very sort of strict sense. Like, when someone suggests to me an outlandish idea that could work, I will not call it a LARP like most other people will. But whenever someone says, like, we're going to march on Washington and take power tomorrow, literally 24 hours, then, it's LARPing. Basically, that's the distinction that I'll draw. Practical feasibility, not like, I don't care what the odds are that it'll happen, just, can it happen at all? So I very rarely say that someone is LARPing. I have in the past, though, criticized people for inquiring into things for the wrong reason. Not because I don't want them to inquire into it, and I usually make that clear, like, try looking at it from these angles is usually something that I include at the end of my, like, tirade. And that's usually half the tirade is that end point. But the issue that I have with especially is... whenever I will have certain trads and all of that anger me or annoy me or attack me or something like that, I'll usually just call them aesthetic converts. And the reason that I do that is just because as we see happening, especially with Zoomers that convert or adopt something because of the aesthetic, that's not a sure foundation. And that's why you look back at them 8 months later and they went from being a Orthodox absolute monarchist catechumen to a neo-Stalinist atheist or something like that, just because they found the aesthetic to be more appealing or more energetic or it was new. And I'm not just using that out of thin air. I actually had that happen with one of my classmates in high school, and it was kind of my first real life exposure to such a phenomenon. So whenever. Is it the worst thing in the world? No, because they're still inquiring into it. But that doesn't mean that the people that are already there shouldn't, caution them to look into it for better reasons. You don't want someone to look into your church because it's the most based one out there. Because it's very possible that tomorrow it's not going to be. The Roman Catholics have experienced this quite a lot in the last 100 years. And I'm not.
It's a sorry state of affairs,
and I'm no different. And I would probably criticize myself. I converted to Lutheranism from Southern Baptism, and when I went to Lutheranism, it was because I found it to be like the most, at least on paper, I found it to be the most consistent. But it was also the most comfortable, I guess you could say. I wouldn't have said that at the time, but that's what it boils down to be brief. And as a result, I can only conclude that God has punished me for such indolence. He has given me probably the messiest denomination, in that we are being actively subverted and have not just fallen to subversion. So
okay, would you care to speak about that a little bit, because I don't know too much about the workings of the Lutherans. So if you could speak to that.
So there's the already subverted Lutherans that wave around like the trans flags and all of that, and have women priests. No Lutheran considers them Lutheran. They don't have anything that makes them Lutheran. They don't subscribe to literally any Lutherans at all, other than the ones in the modern day. They don't even have like the writings or the interpretations. Like, it is literally just a brand for them. And then you have the supposedly conservative Lutherans that kicked those evil liberal devils out of the seminaries and the institutions, and everything was righted, and now we just get to coast merrily along as Christendom burns. If only. Like, that's a terrible state of affairs as it is, but that would be 100% better than what's actually happening. This is called the LCMS, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. They've been around since the 1840s, I think, or it might be the 1850s, before the Civil War. They have a very rich history, a very rich library, rich history of theologians and historians and priests and pastors. Basically, what's happened is we have a status quo leader, and the guy has, under his watch, either maliciously or ignorantly, hired in a bunch of people called Lutherans for Racial Justice to run most of the events, especially regarding youth and mission work. The people that will be your future church. And Lutherans for Racial Justice, if you cannot, grok the name, it's complete and utter sectarian leftism and Marxism masquerading as something Christian. And they basically just openly admit this. Every single one of their ecclesiastical and layman supporters happen to be communists, either explicitly or implicitly. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, I don't know if you know this, Lutherans in the United States are about 1.5% of the population, if I remember correctly. I know it used to be about 3%, but it has been steadily declining. In Europe, it's been steadily declining. Most historic Lutheran states have either fallen to some form of atheistic leftism, or were conquered by the Soviet Union, or liberalized, did away with any sort of state guarantees on a traditional religion. So Lutheranism not doing that well in its historic homelands. And the LCMS considers this. They consider the fact that there are Lutherans in Europe that are trying to keep the damn thing alive. And they consider the fact that, we're more of a minority than Jews in the United States. And they look at the state of affairs, and they decide, yes, we need to send all of our mission efforts and money towards Ethiopia and Madagascar and the Congo. And we just need to forsake. And that's how originally that was just because they were returning the most on paper results, as if you're supposed to look at mission work by the number of converts and not anything more spiritual or less material. Ethiopia and Madagascar were doing well on paper, and this got criticized by me and a few other people, kind of pointing out that this we shouldn't just be abandoning people in Spain or England or Finland that are trying to keep this thing alive. And I got told by various ordained pastors in the conservative Lutheran Church that the whites had simply turned their back on the true gospel of Christ. So they deserve to not hear the word of Christ.
So
we're not going to do
in racial terms. That's interesting, because I just wanted to mention before we go, speaking of Africa, there is a video on your YouTube channel that I was listening to as recently as today. I highly recommend people go listen to it. It was a video on Kenya. It's around 4 hours long. It's with a gentleman by the name of Panama Hat, and he's going through the entire history of what makes Africa and Kenya specifically so attractive to Europeans. And this just made me think of that, that there's something about Africa that Europeans are just obsessed with. And so when you say that, if we can go into that, about what is it about these places in Africa that is it enraptured them so?
Well, and I'll just finish that story real quick so I can't be accused of misrepresentation. I'll make it brief. Basically, I said they were abandoning the West, and they started saying, well, whites have turned their back on Christ and all this other stuff. And it basically ended up I had become like a muckraker for the synod. The pastors have these chats, and they share my stuff in them. It's mildly psychopathic, but at least my word's getting out there one way or another. But there is a fixation on Africa, and you can tie this down to a few different things. A lot of people will just say that whites tend to be much more preferenced towards the outgroup, so you get a little bit of xenophilia in there. One way or the other, you get that on the left or the right, either by paternalism or by sort of like a cuckoldish fetish for them. So you get that one way or the other, but you also get a sort of very European sense of adventure. You're going to a continent that has barely been populated for its history. No one knows what's out there. It has all of these exotic and almost demonic things that try to kill you, and you have to go there and stop them and tame them and bring civilization to the continent that is unmapped. That's the typical scramble for Africa rhetoric. But it still exists somewhat to this day. And even after the scramble for Africa, when you had people trying to actually build up Africa, especially the English, you had in that stream that you mentioned, there was the infamous lion incident in Kenya, where there were two lions that were picking off people from villages and train infrastructure projects and taking their skeletons and corpses to a cave and just piling them up systematically. Very sort of demonic behavior. So you get that sort of a draw to there as well. You have to bring Christ to it. The demons have inhabited the continent, not the people, not like a racial thing, but like the continent itself has not heard Christ, and it's demonic. So you get those draws, and then also the geography, the natural bounty, the resources, and the climate tend to lend itself well to the different European ethnic groups. So if you are in the Mediterranean, obviously North Africa and parts of the southern half of the continent tend to draw you to it. There are parts in the middle along the coastline that look a lot like England or parts of Germany. So it's kind of like a new start, if you will, because especially when Europeans first arrived for the scramble for Africa, the African population was minuscule. So you kind of get like a new start in a place that is very similar to where you just came from, much more hostile. So you get the challenge, you get something that feels like home but untamed, you get the religious aspect to it, you get the natural benefit, it was very rich, and you basically kind of also have that sense of adventure.
It's true, because for a lot of people, and when I say a lot of people, I mean my big stupid white head, that when I think of Africa, it's like just hacking through a jungle with a machete. But even within that clip about Kenya, what made it so attractive to Europeans was that the climate and the terrain was very, very similar to that of England, and that there's a lot of similarities there. And I think a lot of people, myself included, probably don't think of it like that, but if you were to step off the boat, you'd say, wow, this is like everything I love times two.
Right, yeah. And the other reason that we specifically picked Kenya, not just because my close friend had ties to it, is because it provides a stark contrast to the often memed short-lived Rhodesia in our spheres. Because people hold that up as some sort of ideal because it has cool aesthetics and it has like an edgy message. But if you step back for a moment and consider the real implications of Rhodesia, it did not end well for the whites that went there. And being as whites are my people, and I have a sort of a Pauline duty to my people, I don't want another Rhodesia. You either want the Rhodesia to succeed, which you can make a moral argument for whether a Rhodesia should exist, being as the Africans are now established there. But you also don't want people to be slaughtered of your own group just for the sake of slaughtering them. Kenya, you can make a bunch of arguments about policies that you don't like there, but as was articulated by my friend, there was never some wholesale initiative to just destroy the whites there, and in fact, they often remained on very friendly terms. So that is a much more favorable outcome for whites, the sort of Kenya pseudo-integrationist, decentralized country, than the Rhodesia, how long was it independent? Maybe, was it a decade or so? And at the end, basically all the white farmers get maimed and expelled.
People like it because, oh, look, we found a race war. They're just excited to find
a
one.
race war that was also prosperous as well for the whites for while they were there.
Yeah, and to me, unfortunately, that the more we learn about Africa, the more of these very nuanced histories we learn, the worse Somalia looks. It really comes up once you see how great all these places are. It's like, damn, this really is fucking Mordor, isn't it?
when the Kenyans are telling Somalis to pack up their things on their camels and go back home in the 80s or whatever it was. It might just be that Somalia sucks just a little, and maybe there's a reason. I'm not going to speculate on here. I don't know what the boundary is, and I don't actually know the reason. So, but something to contemplate.
It's the meme, the black arm, the white arm, clasping arms, it's just hating Somalis in the middle.
Yeah, and the Americans that we are, or Americans, perhaps in scare quotes or other punctuation, have decided to import them right into perhaps one of the most previously whitest and most climate-adjusted states for whites en masse. So we have that to look forward to as as we realize the implications of importing foreign populations into our United States. So
it is funny. It's like when people talk about the feds being after everyone. I'm like, no, they're not after us because there's people in our sphere. I'm not going to speak for you, but maybe for me, we're at such an advanced level of racism that we're like, man, I love Kenyans, but I just hate Somalis so much.
and I mean, okay, even if we were to work with the more hardliner racists, I'm going to dissociate myself from them in case this ever gets taken out of context here. If we were to work with them, you're not even being told to like Kenyans. You're just being told that Kenya is a better outcome for you as a white than Rhodesia was because you get to keep your farm and you don't get to be ethnically destroyed. That's the purpose of it.
And we can live in castles. You can do whatever we want. Like on the dissident right, there's a real back to Africa movement happening right now. I'm going to be leading the charge.
Man, if this isn't titled, back to Africa, but from the right, I'm going to be very disappointed.
Like I'm in Canada. Like it's kind of becoming Somalia, so I'm just going to head down to where it's warm because there's not a lot keeping me here right now.
Yeah.
Imagine walking out and it's just perfect weather and not either too damp and cold at the same time, or
And I mean, if Mr. Cat is correct, I mean, it sounds like you wouldn't be too terribly shunned there, just being given the extreme English influence, and as alongside you be able to find like an actual white population. Which, even in parts of the United States, that might be a difficult thing to find.
Yeah, and I'm just to say this, I'm talking myself into liking this as we go. So here's the sell, here's the pitch for the Europeans of the distant right. You move to Africa, you can be whatever type of white guy you want to be. Because right now, like, I bet everyone's got in their mind, like, I want to be like a Roman. You can go to Africa and just dress like an ancient Roman. They're not going to know the difference. Me, I've been very detailed about my plan, my 5-year plan to become Cajun. So I can go and dress like Neo and become a Cajun guy. And they don't know. They just know that to them, that's what normal white people are. They don't know that that's retarded yet.
And by God, you could probably even put on your like red coat and khakis and pith helmet and go down there, and it would probably be semi-normal. Like
all they know about us is from the movies, and our movies are really weird.
Oh, good. I think the most modern movie I've watched is probably from 7 or 8 years ago. Like that's I dread to think of what the world thinks of Western civilization now from our cultural output.
I feel like myself going on a tangent, but I find that interesting. So you're not, you're probably the opposite of me, who's too much into movies, but you're kind of off movies then.
Okay. So when I was growing up, typically the line with my family was, we're not gonna let you watch the stuff that you're too young for. We had religious customs, even though oftentimes we didn't go to church, which might explain me not being too partial towards Southern Baptist, but regardless. And also the thing was, you also have to, if it has a book that's like recognized as good, you have to read that before watching the movie. And that's what I did for most of them. But, after a certain amount of time, I just preferred books more than movies. So and that's how I got into history, was I would just read transcripts and books and all this other stuff that obviously was not meant for movie adaptation. So, and in the last couple of years, probably the majority of movies that I've watched in my life have been in the last 2 years. And they're from like 1930 to 1990, probably is the vast majority of them. So
90 is a good year. So let me just preface this by saying that you probably have a far more healthy way of approaching popular culture. I saw many, many movies when I was young that I probably shouldn't have. So, and I think there's 2 movies that I saw right around the same time that probably, looking back, defined my entire adult political outlook. So the 2 movies were Dangerous Minds, starring Michelle Pfeiffer, I believe, with the theme song was the hit Gangster's Paradise by Coolio. And it's about, it's one of the first ones where it's like, the well-meaning white liberal woman goes to the inner city school and teaches them that like Shakespeare is just another way to rap. And she comes in, and then they like, oh damn, what's up, Teach? And then this one's pregnant, this one's in a gang, and she's got to save them. I forget how it ends. I think she does. So that's one that influenced. The second one would be the live action Mortal Kombat movie. So I think those two together is essentially my political ideology.
Yeah. Okay. See, I have not actually watched the live-action Mortal Kombat movie, but it's become a little bit of a meme among my friend group. So
the first one is good. Don't let anyone tell you it's not good. There's going to be a lot of old fuddy-duddies saying that it's not a meme. It is. Everyone shut up. It's one of the greatest movies ever made. Now, you go into that with my endorsement. You're going to have a great time watching that movie. It's got probably the last cool Asian guy in a movie. And that's like there's like fucking Bruce Lee, then this guy, then nothing until now, and maybe Jet Li, but I think he's a hologram. I don't think Jet Li exists.
I mean, yeah, last cool Asian guy, pretty big badge of merit there.
Yeah, and they're trying to do it now, but they're not going to succeed because it's a political thing for them. Like, we have to reclaim Asian masculinity, and like, I'm not buying it. You guys had a cool thing going of being kung fu geniuses until you decided that was racist. So now, I'm sorry, I guess you can't be kung fu geniuses.
Yeah, and I mean, reclaiming reclaiming X masculinity in the modern day just sums up to making everything else around you more feminine and doing absolutely nothing to your actual masculinity. So in the movie, I will bet money that it's not going to be that they're bringing back like the cool ninja Asian stereotype. It's probably just going to be they're going to look normal for the modern day, and everyone around them is just going to whine to them.
Yeah, he's going to be a guy dressed like a hipster in modern Asian masculinity and rolling his eyes. There's going to be a constructed scene where a white guy mispronounces a type of noodle, and then that's supposed to be, I guess, a laugh break for us. Right, sorry, we're getting into movies. So everyone's going to be, they're throwing popcorn at the screen right now. I'm going on about movies again. But it is good. Like, it's interesting because you're coming at it with a kind of a fresh mind, where you probably look at movies and pop culture a bit more analytically. I know that's a big thing in our scene,
Kinda. I mean, when I watched, I was for a discussion that I had with Mr. Stephen Carson, Radical Liberation, does the economic stuff on YouTube, that I co-hosted with for the longest time. Stopped because of schoolwork, but he basically gave me a list, and he just said, watch whatever you can out of this. We'll discuss it for like a fun show come Thursday. And I watched All Quiet on the Western Front, the old 1930 rendition. And then I watched like Dr. Strangelove and The Man That Would Be King and all, and when I was watching them, I wasn't thinking like analytically or trying to find the ideological statement or even thinking about what's the symbolism or stuff like that. I just enjoyed the movies, except for All Quiet on the Western Front. That one made me sick, but Strangelove and The Man That Would Be King, I just enjoyed the movie. It was well made. Strangelove was hilarious. So were parts of The Man That Would Be King. And there was there's an implicit moral lesson that you can get from these things without having to go like English major and analyze, who are the protagonists, who are the antagonists, who's the anti-hero, what is the symbolism of this scene. The moral message is implicit. So with The Man That Would Be King, it's Kipling. It talks about all the different, it talks about bonds of friendship between men. It talks about, being too greedy. It talks about being too egotistical. It talks about power corrupting, and all this other stuff. It talks about lies being exposed. With Dr. Strangelove, it's Kubrick. It's a little bit slightly more on the nose, I would say, than Kipling. Yeah. But still very professionally done. It's talking about, just the ultimate futility of a nuclear war and on a less major scale, just war itself, So
yeah, for a Kubrick movie, it always seemed a bit of a sillier one, and everyone would say it holds a very strong position in the pantheon of great movies. But when I think of Kubrick, I would think of Barry Lyndon. These that's
the other one.
Movies,
I absolutely loved that one as well. And that was the one that I did get analytical on and kind of rewatched it for symbolism. But the first time I watched through it, it was like it was like a classic epic. We're going through this guy's life about how he's going to rise to great success and then fall to terrible depths, and then that's the end of the life because in epics you don't get your nice storybook ending unless it's Vikings. So I absolutely love Barry Lyndon.
And what's interesting is that there's something within the DNA of these movies and the way they're directed that they really appeal to anyone. And the one example I give to people is my wife. My wife, but seriously, but she usually doesn't like the types of movies that I like. But once you're married to someone for a long time, you kind of mold around each other. But I would show her movies that are classic movies, and she doesn't like old movies really. But I'll show them, and then she will still like those, even though on the surface she shouldn't. One example, funny example, would be Top Gun. I'm like, there's no way a woman's going to like this, but she loved it because there is something in the way that story's told and the nature of the story that is appealing. And then, another example more close to what we're talking about is Eyes Wide Shut by Stanley Kubrick's last movie, for people who don't know. Very, very dark, very challenging movie, very long. But it's a
documentary about your ruling elites.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, and she knows me. Like we're the same politically, So she I'm like, no, this is it. And I forgot about how short that whole scene is. The scene in the orgy. I'm like, oh shit, that's like 10% of this movie. I keep forgetting it's like 3 hours long. But that she was in it the entire time. Like there's something about the way these movies are done that on the surface someone like her and the commoner shouldn't like, but I don't know, that there's something kind of magic about that. I always find that interesting.
Yeah, and so my girlfriend typically doesn't like watching movies at all, and she basically, what I think it is, just from what she's described, because it's an emotional feeling. That feeling you get if you watch a really good movie and then it ends, and then you're sort of left slightly hollow just a little bit. Like not like it hasn't resolved correctly, but like even if you can take something masterful like The Lord of the Rings, and if you watch through the whole thing, at the end it kind of just it's kind of like a what now feeling.
Yeah, especially if it's in the theater. And maybe people lose this as we stop going to movie theaters, and this is just an old chud, thinking of the past. But there's that movie when you see a great motion picture in the theaters, and everyone's going out at the same time, and you're back in the public, you're back as a person, and you're all thinking about the same thing at the exact same time. It's a very interesting feeling, especially if you're there with your parents or a wife, and you're just kind of, you can see everyone around you is in deep contemplation. I think that's just a good moment to have. And it's not jubilant like when you leave a concert, everyone's kind of on a music high. It's not a high, it's something else. Yeah.
And so she doesn't like movies because I think she gets that to a much more extreme measure. Because the way she originally described it to me was like it felt like a waste of time, and then I like pushed her on that, and she was like, "Well, I enjoyed it. It wasn't a waste of time." But so that feeling is what she'll get. So I have to like comb through the movies that I think that she'll get something out of, kind of like that resolves so well that there's not that hollow feeling, or if there is a hollow feeling, it's intentional, and the audience knows that. Barry Lyndon is exactly the movie that fits that description because it doesn't have the storybook happy ending. It kind of just ends on a very low note that's not anticlimactic. Like obviously the symbolism resolves itself, but at the end of it, it's like you're reminded this is just a guy. It's not like some protagonist in a storybook with plot armor. The guy loses his leg, he loses the duel, he loses his money, he loses his wife, he loses his estate, he loses his son, he loses everything except for his mother, and he just goes back to Ireland at the end. Yeah,
I will say two things to say that. One, it's good that you're introducing your girlfriend to this because, as I've said, who's got the clip? Marriage is nothing but, maybe you get there one day, but just relationships with women are ideally a multi-decade project to introduce women to the divine autism of men. So I'm teaching her how to like this weird shit. Another movie that you might like if you haven't seen it, and I have to watch Barry Lyndon again because they seem similar, but maybe my memories run them together. It's a movie called The Libertine starring Johnny Depp.
Oh, okay.
I believe it's filmed not exactly the same way, but I recall it's set around the same time. It's about it's after a real guy. Fuck, I should have looked this up before I started talking. But it's a kind of a Victorian era it's filmed with a lot of natural light, like Barry Lyndon
Oh,
was,
okay.
because that's what it
Yeah,
was
yeah.
famous for. All these weird lenses, everything was lit with candles and stuff. So there's an eerie darkness sometimes. It's like that. It's just about this character. It's about his rise and fall and things like that. I would say it's probably one of Johnny Depp's better roles, even though it's very much him. He's kind of pompous and whatnot. But so it's called The Libertine. People look that up. I remember liking it. I remember watching it a lot, but give it a shot and report back. We'll talk about The Libertine someday. It's pretty new too. It was way in the 2000s.
Got on my list, and just to like show you, like when I said I am working back through everything in the last 2 years, like the movies on my list to watch are like Predator 1 and 2, Blade Runner, Terminator 1 and 2, The Libertine,
Man.
Event Horizon. Like I haven't seen any of these things. Just because of popular culture, I know like the memes and the parodies, but like I haven't actually seen them is the thing. And
you're in for a ride, man. You got some of the best stuff. It's funny that my co-host, who unfortunately couldn't be here, but he was raised in a very, very strict sort of Christian branch. I don't know what denomination it was, but it was kind of strange. But he was cut off from a lot of popular culture growing up. And the thing we always talk about is that he never grew up with The Simpsons. He doesn't know anything about The Simpsons. And just speaking to him, I'm like, there's actually a lot of references we use in everyday bullshit that he just doesn't get. And I can't explain it because it's not as funny if I explain it. Like you actually just needed to fall in love with it when you watched it and then fall out of love and now you hate it. But there's like a golden period there.
And I can tie something back into what we previously discussed. I would be willing to bet that most Zoomers have not seen what every other generation would consider to be a classic movie.
True.
Like even like we were talking about, Doctor Strangelove being in like the sort of pantheon of classic movies. Like I don't even know anyone my age that I didn't introduce the movie to that had like heard of it. Like even the name, like before going into it, I just knew like the name Doctor Strangelove. I had no clue what it meant before I watched it. All my peers wouldn't even recognize the name. I would be willing to bet that not one of them has seen it. So this is just the thing with. I don't mean to tie back into the topic we already discussed, but just to kind of show you where I'm kind of working from is that with the Zoomers, you don't kind of get this cultural continuity either, even if it's just like 20 years ago. Like it's one of the consequences of being raised with the internet, and like even then I was behind. I only got my phone when I was in 8th grade and not like in 5th grade or whatever. So being raised on the internet, the consequence of that is you are starting from just complete atomization, not because everyone's told to just be pure individuals, but because there's no internet-wide culture or canon or civilization or anything like that, or family. Literally everything is fluid on the internet.
Yeah, and meme culture. Some people just exist within the sphere of meme culture, and meme culture is only like 20 years old. Really? I mean, that is, I guess, a long time, but your cultural reference points don't go back to anything really from the 80s. And that's interesting because a lot of these old classic movies would be still within the zeitgeist because they were just called back to within, like within The Simpsons. The Simpsons would have an episode referencing some old Twilight Zone episode. So the cultural, so some people might even call that hyper reality, which is a word that gets bandied about a lot. But so this sounds like a good claim. I don't know if it's true, but I kind of want to say it anyway, which is a lot of Zoomers don't even have hyper reality. They don't even have fake reference points, because you could argue that it's just a fake thing referencing a fake thing. I'll cop to that, sure. But then if Zoomers don't even have that, all they have is meme culture, which only has a cultural memory of like 15 years, maybe.
Right, I remember I was, my friends and I, one evening, like we had just got done playing for a concert or something like that, and we were eating, and someone pulled up like Simpson compilations, and we were just laughing at them. The only jokes that like really landed, and this, I'm not claiming this one's representative. I make claims about the Zoomers as a whole. This one's just my friend group. I have no clue, because I've not watched anyone else react to Simpsons joke compilations. The only ones that landed in the friend group, besides with me, who just like does this stuff as the weirdo, relative to my peers, anyways. The only jokes that land are the ones that are self-contained, like the ones that are, just obvious jokes. If it was a reference, the joke would not land, unless it was like the newer episodes where you didn't need like the cultural continuity. So like if it was The Simpsons making a joke about the copyright or morals or something like that, the joke would land. But if it was The Simpsons referencing like a movie from like the 80s or the 70s, would not land. Or even like referencing like old stories, like the Simpsons, if I remember correctly, referenced like quite a lot of just stories that were in the cultural consciousness that might have been a couple hundred years old.
It's funny. Like that we would always joke, like, back when people like Robert De Niro were actors, like that's a completely alien epoch to these people.
Yeah. So like even those references don't land, and part of that could be the failure of the public schools. I have a video on that. It didn't get as much views, probably because it's a more boring topic than me saying the Zoomers are like failing. It's not as outrageous, but Zoomers, unless someone directly tells them, will not find these old stories. They will not find, like, you might, because of memes or because of, mimetic points about all the Disney fairy tales used to be much more gruesome, they might know the name, the Brothers Grimm, but they sure as hell have not read the Brothers Grimm. They won't know the old Danish stories about the Little Mermaid. They won't know the old stories from Kipling about the monkey's paw, or about the men that would be king, or anything like that. They won't know any of the old American folkloric stories. They won't know any of these other things unless they get told. Even in the English classes, where you're supposed to go over, like, the Puritan settlers in New England, Plymouth Plantation's a very common one, Shakespearean plays like Hamlet or Macbeth. Romeo and Juliet usually gets thrown out in the freshman year. Usually they don't even read that. And even then, the sort of, what they do get just through the classes in the public schools are barely enough to just give them, like, the plot summary. So, like, you don't get this cultural continuity, especially because, their friends aren't talking about it. There's no self-contained culture anymore in the U.S. or in Oklahoma or in a region or in a town because it's all on the internet. Everything is just sort of liquidated. And then you also don't get the sort of familial continuity because there's so much of family destruction. The divorce rate's sky high for Zoomers. I remember in one of my extracurriculars, literally every single person in there came from a family that had a divorce with the parents, not even considering grandparents or something like that. So you don't get familial continuity. You don't get like mom, dad, and siblings just on the couch watching a movie or something like that. It doesn't exist. So
I'm curious to see if millennials turn that around, because just to start by saying that, and we'll get to the actual topic we wanted to discuss in just a minute, but we got some heaters coming through right now, and I like this. But there was a post made by a good friend of the show, Mike from Imperium Press, and this would have been a while ago, but he made a comment within the post, something like, I truly believe, and I'm paraphrasing, but I truly believe that historians will study this thing called the dissident right for years to come as a gathering of some of the most interesting minds of a few generations. That's what I truly believe. Radical historians, revisionists, very serious people. And when I look at that kind of gives me hope. And what I see is people, like you had just said, like we're just talking about, it's very difficult for anyone to discover these things. So at the very least, one thing that animates and unites everyone in the dissident right is this yearning to rediscover something real, something true. You've got these independent publishers digging up out of print books and making them available. Some of this knowledge hadn't been known for like 100 years. And now there's these like 22-year-olds reading it. You've never seen that before. That was unheard of for like a couple generations. So like that's fascinating to me. And that kind of gives me hope. And like you just said, that the trend now with parents and maybe some older millennials, but Gen X and boomers especially, was, broken homes, divorced, a type of parenting that I think is falling out of fashion. And it's probably too early to say this for Zoomers, but that's why I'm looking at millennials. And as millennials start to have bigger and bigger families, I'm interested to see, because we have a lot of talk. We have a big talk here on the right about, tradition and rebuilding the family and everything like that. I'm curious to see if they actually do it.
Right.
I'm hopeful that they will, but maybe time will tell. Sorry.
Yeah, no, sorry. I should just don't apologize for me interrupting you on your show. Like, my gosh. Yeah, there were 2 points in there, and yeah, I'll rip on trads just because sometimes they'll annoy me or attack me or stuff like that. But they're probably the people that I would most get along with if a mainstreamer or a gatekeeper or like someone from my college campus was placed in the room next to me in the trad. Suddenly then we become the greatest of friends. But and I have hope that regardless of whatever the reason is, hopefully there is a strong enough foundation there that the trads will embrace something like larger families. Hopefully they'll forsake birth control and divorce and all this other poisonous material that's been introduced to our society. And then the other point about the dissident right being the most at least interesting set of minds in the modern day, or at least in this era. You have to wholeheartedly agree with that for the simple reason the nature of political narratives, just how it is with mass media and with modern media, they do not allow deviation. So for 15 years, if you have heard the same two large groups of talking points just battling it out, marching to the left, it's going to get boring very quickly. If you see the exact same talking points just move slightly to the left from the years 1990 to 2020, you're going to look for, where's the flavor, because if I go to the Victorian times, you get liberals, socialists, communists, eugenicists, you get absolute monarchists, you get secessionists, ethnic conflict. It's interesting. In the modern era, you get, if you were to study the U.S. from 1990 to 2020, you get, status quo conservatism versus leftward marching status quo. So not interesting, not flavorful. Everything else gets suppressed. That's the narratives. The dissident right is the only group of people, and this is what I would say. I would say this is a negative. We lack a coherent narrative. But that's also just going to be really good for the historians, just because that makes us interesting. You can find any feasible or infeasible opinion here. You'll have people that aren't afraid to say, perhaps races are inherently different, and there are benefits and negatives to one or the other. Or they can take it further and say that one's superior and one is inferior. You'll have people that'll say we should bring back theocracies just because that was the state of Western civilization for a millennium and a half. You'll have people that will try to come up with a coherent law code and say this will sound like I'm bragging, but I don't think you hear it very much else in the mainstream. If we're going to treat abortion as murder, then we need to execute murderers. So, you're not going to find this stuff in the bland two narratives or omni-narrative, if you want to go scope out just a little bit farther, just because it goes against it. So we have to be the only interesting group. The only other potential is the people farther to the left than the mainstream left narrative. But even then, they're not that interesting. They mostly just, whenever push comes to shove, they back the mainstream left.
Yeah, and there is a true energy, and people are probably tired of me saying this, but I will say with a full-throated genuineness that I wouldn't want to be any other place in the world. Everyone's like, I gotta log off. I gotta get my life on track. This is great. I'm having the time of my fucking life over here. And I could be doing anything else. I'm reading The Law of Civilization and Decay by Brooks Adams, which is not easy to read, on a weekday for free. I could be in a fucking hot fudge sundae, but I'm not. I'm doing this. And I see within, and this is a multi-generational project, because a lot of the best guys in our scene are kind of older guys too. I don't want to throw anyone under the bus. The idea is that we're the only ones fulfilling the promise of the internet, in that we have such a, people get hard on ourselves, like, oh man, we're bad at technology. No, we're not. We're probably the best people on earth with technology, and have a better conceptualization of OPSEC and how you got to juggle your identities across different platforms. And we're the only ones out there. There's a statistic that gets passed around a lot in marketing circles, which is kind of I'll try not to deviate too much into this, but on average, the people look at the same 5 websites every single day. They don't really go off the reservation and look out new things. And one of those would be Facebook. Another one might be a news site or something. People aren't curious. We're the only ones out there trading obscure PDFs and like digging out old theories on things. And I'm like, that is, and they're making it fun and making it exciting, and they're doing it not as a grift. And I'm like, and my goal is to communicate that to other people and say, if you go into a leftist, I used to be in lots of leftist anarchist chats just to see. They're so boring. They're so like, you're just surrounded by weird junkies, and then they're talking about people who read books suck. And I'm like, well, but then what are we doing? What are we doing? This is just getting free heroin with extra steps. This isn't anything. Sorry.
I mean, you play, you took, like, the most interesting things that we do, which is dig up the obscure parts of history that have literally been either completely suppressed or completely forgotten for the last 80 years. You can even take, like, the mainline stuff. Like, we have people pulling up documents from, like, the Reformation that even history students studying the Reformation don't do anymore because they're too focused trying to fit into the narrative of, like, how was the Reformation trans-inclusive or trans-exclusive. Like, they aren't studying what Calvin wrote in response to the Lutherans, or what the Council of Trent tried to repudiate, and how that relates to the culmination of a universal Catholic civilization declining or something like that. They aren't doing that anymore. The very fact that the people that we're going up against, the very fact that they're lowering their standards to such an abysmal degree is a great benefit to us, because it, quite honestly, and to anyone out there that might think that they have a talent that is too boring for people in our spheres, it doesn't matter that you are doing something that would have normally been seen by a normal person in normal times as boring, just because if you do it well, and if so long as you have, like, at least a mediocre ability to write and edit, it will be seen as revolutionary now, just because the universities and the researchers aren't doing their damn jobs.
Yes, exactly. Like, for me, I'm in marketing. That's boring. And yet, I've built myself up to be the shining, guiding star of the dissident right. And if I can do that...
I love it. Yeah, self-confidence.
But it is true. Like, I love communicating this idea out to other people. And guess what? You talking about how we're the only ones talking about the Reformation in any detail. And some people might on the outside find that threatening. But guess what, motherfucker? We're also doing it in comic books starring Neon Genesis Evangelion characters and SpongeBob's characters. You're not going to get that anywhere else. We may actually make these big ideas fun and cooler. And if you go into a chat, and you just, like, guys discussing 17th century elite theory politics and just talk like sailors, like drunken sailors. I'm like, that's fun. Show that no one's doing that on any campus.
And I mean, if you look at movements throughout history, they'll either be really high effort, like the 1848 revolutions, which spawned, 4 out of 5 great ideologies in the modern era, or they'll be really, really low effort, like Ludditism, which kind of just... it's a pejorative now that it's not even describing the original idea. You get these sort of breaks that they're all either within the really high effort camp or the really low effort and just fizzle out. With our sphere, you get both. So you will have, like, the academics and the people producing actual worthwhile, academic content, having these 4-hour streams about like a 180-year-old article that they drudged up from an obscure thinker that's perfectly predicting our modern era. And then immediately after that, 24 hours later, you'll have someone that has condensed it into a 2-panel meme that includes SpongeBob, the Ayatollah, and, like, a horse or something like that.
And I can't tell whether it's for or against any of these references. It's having fun with it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing as well. Like, it was back in the my first 2 introductions into the political world were Brexit. That was when I started latching on to, like, Sargon's content, and the 2016 American election with Trump and Clinton, for obvious reasons with that latter one. And the big sort of copium during that, to be anachronistic, the big sort of copium during that time frame was the right's just going to win because it has meme power. And
Oh, yeah,
that
meme
might be
magic. That was the big
yeah,
thing.
yeah, meme magic, and maybe to an extent, but people took it way too far. But there is an underlying truth there, that we do just produce superior memes. It's why all that we have to do is say 1350 and we get banned off of every platform and people lose their shit. And the leftists basically have to write a 20 tweet thread about why heroin needs to be subsidized for 5-year-old children. So,
Yeah. I was going to ask you, you brought something, and this might be a silly question, but because you referenced Sargon, and I've checked in on Sargon recently. He's the Lotus Eaters. Then, do
yeah.
you think Sargon has come around on any points that he might have hand waved away or hated in the past?
Oh, by God, yes. I mean, I remember back in like 2000, late 2015, when the American election was starting to heat up and whenever Brexit was sort of culminating and all this other stuff, he put out a video, and it was called like "The Conservatives Are Not Your Friends," talking about the UK Tory party. And he basically said they want to lower, or they want to do away with the minimum wage, and they want to ban pornography and all this other stuff that violate social liberalism and all, like complete bland leftism. And then you jump to the modern day, and he's talking about we need a strong leader to preserve our societies and our borders. We need to do away with societal ills and the rot and all this other stuff. And it's just, he has completely come around just in ways that are very subtle. And people write him off sometimes, and I do it as well. If I lose patience is not a virtue that I possess, and I desperately try to work on it. Not really working that well, though. I'll lose patience with him sometimes and say he moves at a fucking glacier's pace, and I don't even know why we bother with him. And then whenever I cool down, like I realize how much of an intellectual debt I owe to him. So yeah, that's just me acting childish. But he moves at such an incremental pace that people really don't go back to like 2015 when he was talking about how the conservatives bad because they want to ban pornography. And then you look in the modern day and he's like, yeah, the elites hate you and they will use any method, implicit or explicit, to destroy you.
Well, and that's what happened to me because I kind of checked in on him, like I said, and I see him on a stream, a pretty long one with Academic Agent, and I think maybe Charlemagne, and I'm like, whoa, okay, here we go. Now he's talking about some stuff I never heard him talk about before, and they were I think they were going over Jordan Peterson's conservative manifesto, whatever he called it. And, the things I didn't know it was him. I'm like, damn, this guy's, this radical sounds like Sargon. Maybe it's because all British people sound the same to me. By golly, then I stared at the screen and there he was.
Yeah. I mean, and that was you remember the heady days of the big arguments being Sargon and like Crowton Tea. Versus like slightly more left-wing people. Yeah. and like you go back to that and the voice is still there. He's much more fit now. He looks much more well put together. He's much more learned. But also he's much more sophisticated intellectually. He is no longer saying we can just vote our way out of this if we just get like these guys, if we just get Farage to run. Like, he's realized that this is a much deeper problem than just electoral democracy.
That's a good point. And I do get, notes of that when I do hear from him. And that's good because the only other way for him to go was the opposite direction. And I'm glad he didn't. Right. It's kind of got me in the mood to go check in on some of these guys I haven't checked in on in a while, I want to go check on, Stefan Molyneux. Maybe he's wearing a Stahl helm with some pagan sigil on it. I don't know. There might be some weird stuff going on over there.
I mean, I did not start with Stefan Molyneux. And in fact, I kind of like caught him in the middle. And whenever he disappeared, I was basically just getting into high school, and I was too busy to actually find out what happened to him. Like, I know Free Domain Radio and all that is his, his location, but I never actually kept up with him. But he sort of appeared at the middle of my intellectual journey, and he really pushed me along quite well. He was really good at talking about, especially how men were being abandoned by society. He had very lucid, very sort of from the ground up points. That were friendly to newcomers, and that's something the dissident right is god awful at. Is you're lost if you try to join right now. There's no one just articulating things constantly from the ground up. But anyways, so Stefan
I agree completely.
Stefan Molyneux just kind of appeared in the middle of my journey and then disappeared. And sadly, I've not kept up with him in any sense. But similar to Sargon, I owe him a slightly more minor intellectual debt, just because he pushed me along trying to see, helping me to see, how bad the modern society is.
Well, that's a very healthy and wise way of looking at it, and I share it the same way. That's kind of a roundabout way of me calling myself wise, if you didn't pick up on that. But
I mean, you're a marketer. You have to find ways to do this without offending people.
In a lot of ways, you've proven why I'm great. But a lot of people dismiss that because they'll say, like, "Oh, I used to like this person, now I hate them." And there's a lot of people. Yeah. I really do believe what the liberals and leftists were saying, which was there was at the time an alt-right pipeline. Now we don't use that term anymore, but just the idea that you can start at one place and then go off in a myriad of different directions. It's not to say you start with Jordan Peterson and end up listening to as a paywall subscriber to the Daily Shoah. But some do. And then maybe some end up in kind of like a different sort of pseudo leftist thing. Maybe another branches off into like, the Tradcath, whatever. But there is a step-by-step process. And I would hate for the takeaway here that people think that we need to destroy that pipeline, or that things that are maybe 5 steps removed from the mainstream can just bring themselves right up to the edge of the mainstream. Like the people aren't ready. You actually need kind of a sequence of ideas being introduced by different people with different rhetorics to get them to the other ones. And this is like an old marketing thing. It's the funnel strategy. Like you get people,
right? Yeah.
It's a process to get them to a final destination. And I think there's a lot of people who kind of pull up the ladder behind them ideologically. Like, no, you actually do need some of these more milquetoast people. Like no one wants to admit it, but a guy like Steven Crowder is a lot of people's first step into this sphere. And, you don't need to love him, but don't be like trying to like, shoot his fucking knees out, because how else do people, he's just he's just edgy enough, not on a lot of stuff, but on a couple things that kind of jailbreak people out of a way of thinking.
Right. He's good at like initial deprogramming, if you will. So with the, we must stop the pipeline is a rallying cry held by the most insidious of left-wingers that actually see reality, and the most egotistical people on the right that just kind of want their like group of friends that can be very proud of they were here before the other plebs got here. They have nothing to contribute because they weren't here first, So it's a very strange way that you've outlined that, and I haven't thought about that before, that there are actually people advocating for kind of like stopping that trend from the right.
And the more radical an idea, you can kind of look at it like a pyramid, if you want. Let's just play with shapes. Let's say a pyramid. You have the more radical ideas at the very, very top, and these also tend to be the most divisive, but they are the most interesting. So someone like, Dugin, let's put up as many red dots in our bodies as we can right now. Someone like Dugin, very divisive guy, but he's trying to do this thing with multipolarity. That's kind of a new thing. Some people would debate it's not. But there, other examples, maybe who else? Maybe even Moldbug, someone like that, with these trippy kind of technocratic ideas. But those need to be introduced to people. Then you got the people at the bottom, where you get someone like a Sam Hyde. Like they're entertainers, and they're introducing people. They're showing people that these ideas aren't scary. And that is the wall of ice that you need to break with people, that a lot of them are allergic to these ideas. They think it's scary. So first you start by showing them it's at least kind of fun. It's fun to do this. It's easy, breezy, beautiful. And then once they're there, it's like, okay, let's introduce you. And not to say it's up a ladder of violence or true, dark radicalism, but it's just more complicated or more ideas that they have never even considered before. So you got to kind of train people. And so for some people, it's the MGTOW movement, because the MGTOW makes you kind of rethink the law. And that seems boring to people like us. But it's through that you get into more traditional stuff. Like I like tradition. Wait, what is tradition? And what do you mean by tradition? And how far do we go back with tradition? And now you've exploded their entire worldview, their entire paradigm. Their existing paradigm has become very, very small. And this is where they, again, can go off in 100 different directions. But this is kind of how you do it, to me at least. So, Stefan Molyneux, that's why they got rid of him. Molyneux, right. My heart breaks for him, and people would think that's a bit too, a bit too gay, but it is like when I saw what they did to him, I bring this up all the time. When I saw what they did to him, I realized, there's no more rules. Because he didn't do anything wrong. He was not out there doing slurs. He wasn't doing any real race stuff. Not really. No anti-Semitism, I don't believe. None of the stuff. But they got rid of him because he was at 1 million subs on YouTube. And people were getting introduced to new things they didn't like.
Yeah, I remember with him, you're saying, I don't think he did anything wrong. I remember the common criticism of him from people on the right. Was that he wouldn't go far enough and name the J and all this other stuff. So, but now, given all these figures that we've said, there is one that I hold as an exception that is just bad.
Okay.
And it's Peterson.
Oh, okay. Now that's interesting. I'd love to hear some more about that.
Just because his stated claim is specifically to de-radicalize people. So regardless of people actually making their way over here, his whole intellectual apparatus is designed to get people slightly outside of the mainstream, but to make sure they will never go farther. And we have plenty of people on our side that will say, I cannot dislike Peterson because he's the reason I'm here. It started with him. He had me reconsider atheism or all this other stuff. Great. There are countless many more people that we don't see on our side for the very specific reason that Jordan Peterson is a de-radicalizer, explicitly makes that known. He's basically a leftist that got left behind. So
yeah, and I think him getting his employment at the Daily Wire as well was probably a note for people okay, well this is nothing now.
And I know I kind of break with AA here and all this other. I actually think that for someone to start with someone like Shapiro, it would be better for them to start with Peterson. Just because with Shapiro, you get sort of he does not center his whole tirades around why you shouldn't go farther to the right. He'll drop that in. Obviously, he'll have maybe an overarching goal, perhaps. But with Peterson, every single thing is geared towards making sure that we give just enough concessions. We make things just tolerable enough to where people don't become scary right-wing extremists. Left-wing extremists are fine to him, remember. Not ideal, but they are better than the right-wing extremists because the right will go on these absolutely immoral, terrible, war crimey war paths. The left, however, it's just sort of boring to him. It's much more tolerable. He'll speak against communism. He'll talk about the death toll and all this other stuff. But he tolerates left-wing extremists. He will talk to left-wing extremists much more than he will a right-wing extremist.
And what was interesting with Peterson was early on, I think a lot of the people, let's say even those in the white nationalist sphere, will look at Peterson and say, okay, this guy is going hard against communism, and we're interpreting that as a dog whistle. And I think that's what got very popular in some circles. But then you would look at his house, and it's full of Soviet-era propaganda and design and art. And I'm looking at that and saying, well, okay, so what is this? What are you really? I don't understand. There's a lot going on with you. There's a unique hatred of communism, but also an obsession with it. And you don't talk about you kind of talk maybe you understand Nazis. I'm okay, but then that's your number one fear is Nazis. I'm I don't know. Is this a new game or has this been a game that evolved over time? You know what I'm saying? He's an interesting character, I suppose.
And much in the same way that people have a lot of skepticism towards the neocons, if you look at someone like Jean Kirkpatrick, who was in the Reagan administration, she started out as a Trotskyite and organized Trotskyites in the United States, and then apparently had a revelation and became much more real and joined the Reagan administration and basically just implemented foreign policy Trotskyism. So Peterson, much in the same way, has something to be very skeptical of. He was the new socialist, was the new Democratic Party. You're Canadian. You could probably tell me much better what the party actually was. So Was that
It was
correct?
always bad. It was, yeah. I think if he was in the NDP, some people will say that it used to be cool under Jack Layton, who it was kind of his
Right.
baby, but it always was more left than liberals, and the liberals in Canada were always extremely far left. And our definition of what was left may have, evolved over time, but they've been pretty firmly, progressive. And then the NDP
Right.
were always straight up communist leftists.
Right. So very similar to a neoconservative in the American sense, Peterson in the Canadian sense, as a Canadian analog, he started with the NDP and had a revelation that all of this stuff was wrong. And now he just preaches people that you shouldn't go too far to the right. That stuff is still bad. We need to cling to liberalism and this sort of social democracy light. And I mean, it's bad if you go too far to the left, but at least you're not a Nazi. But just make sure you don't become a radical. And so, and we can contrast this, and perhaps this is a controversial point that I'm wrong on, maybe even, but at least with someone like Shapiro, absolutely despite. You can check my Telegram channel, and I basically every time I mention the Daily Wire, I have the Daily Wire, comma, the subversive foreign organization, comma. So it will take him just as the hard contrast here that should be very difficult for me to prove. He's an Orthodox Jew. He hires on people like Knowles and Walsh, who are much farther to the right than he is. They obviously can't go too far, but they push the needle to the right. Given his ethnic and religious affiliation, Mr. Shapiro, at the very least, I know he is going to try to subvert me, and that he might be lying through his teeth, but maybe he has some sympathy. With Peterson, he is trying to subvert people, and he buries whenever he says that. So he can say, look, I warned you, I'm just a de-radicalizing agent. But he said all of this 3 years ago, and now he just implies it. So, at least with Shapiro, he advertises the fact that he is basically a foreign national in the country that has loyalties that are outside of the native population here. Well, with Peterson, he's all of his older work where he makes known his origins and that he's a de-radicalizing agent, that's all buried. If you look at his house, you get a lot of the Soviet artwork, which he tries to explain away, and then he kind of shows that he's at heart a xenophile when he talks about his great ties to that native tribe or whatever it is. So, all of these things point to him being a massive subversive that people on the right are sentimental towards, I understand, but it does not make him good.
Yeah, Ben Shapiro may be an Israelite, but Jordan Peterson is, may Allah forgive me, a Canadian.
or a traitor at the very least. But and this is the thing as well. I'm not saying Shapiro is good. I'm saying that he is bad, and so is Peterson.
And now they're doing the same thing, and we'll see what happens with Matt Walsh. I'm keeping an eye on him. He's up to something.
I remember when I first scoped him out, I thought it was absolutely wild that he was on the Daily Wire because he was saying stuff that was actually cultural, that would actually push things towards the right culturally. He was talking about he would have tongue-in-cheek remarks about executing abortionists, and then at the end of the show be like, "Yeah, this is actually murder though." I like him even though he has what we might call a liar's beard. I'm not a fan of his beard, but there's something hidden under some agenda beneath that hair. It doesn't pass the physiognomy test, yes, but he with him there was a big controversy, especially going through the Telegram chats earlier last week, where they were basically just throwing him through the ringer because he would. He sidestepped a question about saying that Jews were the ones that owned everything, and he was basically downplaying the Jewish role in pushing transgenderism and all this other stuff. Which, all right, fine, yeah, he cucked. But realistically, he's doing much more good. Not directly saying that, but giving literally everything that anyone would need to come to that conclusion, just right there in the public and major documentaries. I'm fine with that trade-off. And Peterson would not do that.
Let me just say that when on our show we did cover that speech in question from Matt Walsh, and Admittedly, we might have riffed a bit too hard on him about how he sidestepped the question, and I'm not trying to drag you into the muck on any sort of
Yeah.
anti-Semitism thing, but it was, in hindsight, it does seem noteworthy that he did avoid the question and didn't,
Yeah.
what other people might do, become an attack dog and say, get out of here. What he did was like, I'm not going to dignify that with an answer, and just moved on. Instead of saying they deserve everything they get. And also, if you look to the IQ numbers, I believe in this one thing, I believe IQ exists. Which is what I'm like, okay, all right, maybe I'm going to practice some historical revisionism, as our side is wont to do, and say that I shouldn't have done that.
So, I'm not saying that I'm not saying that don't name the Jew or something like that. I'm not exactly becoming a kosher rightist, if you will. But I am saying there is a trade-off here. And Walsh is doing much more good at pushing that needle towards the right for whomever quality may see it than most of us are doing on our Telegram channels, where we are doing good, we are very productive, but we don't exactly have like film studios making major documentaries that make profit and like reach millions of people and tie in elites and potentially catch the eyes of governments and investors. Most of us aren't doing that. So he is doing good, regardless of whether he names Jews or not. So,
and speaking of subversion, I know you probably got to get going soon, and I hope that we have time.
I have the evening, so it's
Perfect.
Up to you.
Okay, good, because I do want to get to the topic, and this is a fantastic segue that I'm doing right now. But speaking of subversion, the topic that I'll explain the history of this topic. So we're in the chat of the Blood Satellite chat, and someone had mentioned about Mormon infiltration in federal agencies. And I said, I've never heard that before. And on this show, we had covered, we had a little arc, maybe a year ago, about going into the CIA, history of the CIA, history of the FBI, things of that nature, secret government programs, all that stuff. And I never really come across that, but we have an interest in it. There's a foundation there, and I never heard of Mormonism. They said, you got to get in touch with Ryan Turnipseed. He's the expert on this, and so I did. Now I'm going into this cold, though.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm hoping that you can, now when someone said it to me, I perk up. I want to hear more. I want both barrels pointed at my head.
Yeah, okay.
What can you tell me about that?
So usually, I'll give you context and I'll give you why I usually mention this. Usually, whenever I talk about Mormons being subversives, it's an offhand comment just talking about how insidious they are in American history. So there's much more to it usually. There's a wider story there, kind of like a concurrent plot line, if you will. And the reason that I even know any of this is because of my girlfriend is a Mormon pastor's daughter. And I have convinced her to become a Lutheran. She's a catechist. She takes communion weekly. She's baptized and all this other stuff. So that's
this
basically
is
why
positively scandalous. I love it.
So I went into Mormon theology, Mormon historical claims, Mormon historiography, and then I went into their role in American history. That was something I did for myself, because I'm not going to convince a Mormon to stop being a Mormon because Mormons are subversives. You don't tell someone to dislike a group that they're a part of because they're a subversive group. That's just going to put them on the defensive. So I never used it until after it was a done deal. And the thing that I found, if you go through U.S. history, some of the earliest examples of rabid xenophilia in U.S. government is a Mormon senator from Utah, and I believe his name is Thomas Elbert, or Elbert D. Thomas, something like that. The Mormon senator from Utah during the FDR administration in the 40s. And he was basically the early example of a weeb. And if you know me, I absolutely dislike the sort of Japanese encroachment on, basic Anglo culture, just because if a lot of my generation consumes more anime than they will have consumed any old English media. Old Disney cartoons, from classics. They won't have consumed comic books even. You can consider that an Anglo part of culture. It's all anime. That's what they consume. So I already dislike the Japanese. And this Mormon senator from Utah in the 40s is giving speeches in Congress and to his constituencies about why Japan is going to be the rising people of the next century due to their inherent superior qualities and their elaborate culture and all this other bull. right? So
So
that
what was
immediately
the reaction of that at the time, if you don't mind, if we
I
know?
don't actually. I have not been able to find the reaction. I just know that he died in office, if I remember correctly, or got voted out due to him being like basically ill. One of the two. Basically, he came to a natural end, so it wasn't unpopular enough that that he got voted out. And I think that was made to. He made that speech, I think, to support the American occupation of Japan, to make it American friendly. He was basically just saying, "Oh, we need to get the Japanese on side, because if we don't, they'll overtake us. They're just superior."
Just from the back of the Congress, it's like the bitches can't hear you. They're not here. He's simping in government.
Yeah, so that put me on edge. And I said I was going into Mormon historiography. And they were vicious out west. If you don't know the history of Mormonism, basically Joseph Smith is in the burned over district in upstate New York. He was almost convicted of con artist, but he left the district for the trial, so that he basically hopped the trial. It was guaranteed he was going to be convicted for con, for conniving people out of their money through fraudulent means. He
just on that, before we to get further into it, just to recommend you a show about Mormonism that's somewhat critical of it, but I think it treats it fairly, is this show called Under the Banner of Heaven, starring Andrew Garfield, who's one of my current favorite guys in film. But it's a murder show, modern murder show, and he's a Mormon detective. But throughout the course of the show, they go deep into Mormon history, and they depict Joseph Smith and a lot of these very early Mormon things. And I'm sure some Mormon would say it's subversive in some way, but I looked it up and it seemed, but just to add something to that point, that there's a lot of pretty well documented stuff, it seems.
Yeah, and just to add to this tangent, in the original Sherlock Holmes novels, I believe Moriarty was a Mormon.
Really?
I believe it was him or another antagonist, but I'm pretty sure it was him. Anyways, so the Mormons, they get basically started from the con artist. He basically goes to these. He gets kicked out of New York, goes to Missouri, and they get kicked out of there pretty quickly because he and his followers basically just start eloping with multiple women from families that have just for their entire lives either been Baptists, Anglicans, or Lutherans, and eventually Lutherans. They basically get kicked out of there. There's a small minority that lingers around, and eventually that gets exterminated. The governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, quite famously issues the extermination order, saying that it is legal in the state of Missouri to kill a Mormon. That gets rescinded in 1976 or 74, if I remember correctly. So they get kicked out of Missouri for basically ever. They flee to Illinois. And by this time, Joseph Smith has codified their religion. It's basically Freemasonry with a bunch of extra lore behind it, and passing itself off as the true version of restored Christianity. He gets imprisoned in Illinois because he incites a mob to burn down a printing press, and then that guy that owned the printing press finds Smith in prison, and they shoot him. Smith's last words are the Mason call for help, which by Masonic rites is supposed to mean that you basically have to stop what you're doing and help the guy that just issued the call for help. Those are his last words of the great Mormon martyr issuing the Freemasonic call to help. He gets shot, falls out a window, and then the rest of his followers basically go out west in the Great March towards the Salt Lake.
And that part is in the show too, Under the Banner of Heaven. It's in one of the last episodes. It shows that exact thing that you described, and I think they include the Mormon, not the Freemason part in it too, which is very interesting.
And so they march out west. They basically get left alone. They institute polygamy basically off of as if they didn't have it beforehand. They institute it to keep their numbers up, which now they have a utilitarian justification. And they get much more satanic, if you will. They're instituting blood oaths in their temples that non-members aren't allowed to go into, with these altars that are based off of basically occultic descriptions. If you read through it, it basically sounds like someone took a Lovecraftian sort of Dagon temple rite, but it predates Lovecraft and it's in the Salt Lake. But anyways, that's just the best way I can describe it for our audience, hopefully to paint the picture. during this time, if you know anything about American and Canadian history, people are moving out west, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. You have this polygamous, very militant, very very xenophobic, not like in liberal term, but like they hate outsiders at all. They're right in the middle of the main American pathway to go out west to California and Oregon. So what happens? Well, we get a famous example of an American covered wagon train goes out towards Utah, and they get met by the Mormons. And what happens is the Mormons end up basically arresting every single person in the wagon train. You know, if you know anything about American migration out west, by the time you get to Utah, you're usually pretty starved, you're thirsty, you're running low on supplies, you're not the strongest, you're built up, but you could be better, and you're probably running out of firearms and ammunition. So when these Mormons come out to meet you with freshly smithed guns and bullets and hatchets, and they are looking well fed, you basically just try to negotiate with them. So the Mormons say, we're going to be peaceful, we're going to basically sort you all out. And what happens is they end up lining them up by age and executing anyone over the age of 16 and inducting anyone below the age of 16 into Mormonism, which is known as the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And then the Mormons to this day claim it was a miscommunication, so that absolves them of all wrong, which is the fun part there. This is their origins, right? And their religion, if you know anything about it, they believe the American Constitution was divinely inspired. They baptized dead presidents, trying to induct them into their cult. Mormonism is basically the American civic religion, plus Freemasonry, plus some occultic bullshit, plus Satanism, codified into something that passes itself off as Christianity. We can get into theology, but that's not what we're here for. We're here for their subversive measures. So,
before we go on, I just wanted to bring people's attention to another thing, because a lot of people will have anecdotes about Mormons kind of trickle in, and I'm actually going to not go on the side of for or against some of these stories, but I'll leave this up to people whether or not this is cool or not. But you would hear strange stories about like a Mormon breakaway sect just over the border in Mexico in like an armed compound.
Was it the Woolleyites? Was that it?
It might have been, because this would have been reported, I think, in Vice, if I'm being honest. But it was a pretty comprehensive thing. It was about all that they were kind of at war with a cartel was the story. And you're looking at that thinking like, I don't know what this is. Like, it's a militarized church? Is this still a church? Is this even a religion?
Right. So, we'll get into that, just because a very famous American political family, a political dynasty, was actually started in a Mormon colony in Mexico. But yeah, they had several, basically.
Who was that? Mitt
Romney?
Yes.
Well, we'll get to him. But
totally forgot about that. Just
to show what snakes these people are. When the South secedes from the Union, the Mormons made a ton of threats, basically in minor support, saying we'll secede as well in Deseret. We'll divide the Union's attention. It'll be great. I don't know how much the South actually relied on this, but the promise was made regardless of whether the South cared. And basically what happens, I forget if it was Abraham Lincoln himself or one of his advisors, meets with the Mormon president in the territory of Utah. And the next day, polygamy from divine revelation from God is now sinful and always has been sinful. And also we're not seceding because we're good allies of the American government. So they're complete snakes. At least
complete 180 on everything.
Yeah. And this will be a theme. So that's kind of where they stand. They just do whatever the U.S. government tells them because they're the American civic religion on steroids. I don't know how well you know your Great Depression history. I know it heavily impacted Canada. Do you all know about the Smoot-Hawley tariff?
I do not.
Okay, so that's usually pointed as like the terrible policy from the United States that cut down like 90% of the world's trade after the stock market crash. Basically, it was one of the most punitive tariffs ever introduced in the history of the world at probably the worst time. And one Reed Smoot was a Mormon senator who advocated this, knowing full well the consequences. Like, he wasn't an idiot. Most people realized that there would be consequences. Some people actually bought into it. He knew the consequences, and he voted for it because it would make Mormons. It would bring Mormons more wealth. Yeah, so you have this basically competing ethno-religious group in the United States that is willing to completely screw over the rest of the country just so long as it enriches them.
And I remember a similar claim because we had covered, some people might think this would have been maybe a strange coverage, but we covered like the history of the central bank and the Federal
Yep.
Reserve and things like that. And there's a lot of claims that, a lot of things hinge on the Great Depression and the decisions made at the Great Depression, and that, depending on where you land on the conspiracy spectrum about how much of it was the banks trying to centralize their power and tank the markets on purpose. I think a lot of, as far as conspiracy theories go, that's not even the crazier one. I think a lot of mainstream people would even believe that. And so it's not, I say this to say it's not far and away crazy to assume that there would be groups or organizations within the United States who would try and engineer something like that on purpose.
Yeah. And so that's just one example. Like I'm not going to be able to show you where the Mormons themselves said we're going to become a subversive ethno-religious group and try to subvert everything. Like I can just show you patterns like we do with literally anything else. And at some point, 7 coincidences starts to become an actual pattern and not just coincidences. So, we have that happening. And then you skip forward just a little bit when the Civil Rights Act is being introduced, especially the 64 and the ones that would come afterwards. The 64 Civil Rights Act and the ones afterwards that would have the provisions on women, the real subversive floodgates opening. And if you know anything about that in American political history, basically this is the end of your freedom of association that literally the Puritan colonies that first came to these shores were founded on. Was disassociating from the Church of England, and now 1964, you're basically screwed if you want to disassociate from people. So there was a provision that was going to be added that was supposed to give equal employment rights for women in an effort to get them to join the labor force. Now, you and I, in our sort of in our evil papist, Luthero-papist is what I get called on Twitter sometimes, with our Luthero-papist morality, we usually dislike women being thrown into the workforce for obvious reasons, hopefully obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Screws over families, depresses wages, your living standards decrease, and women basically just become their own entities and get told to be men, and when they can't be men, they fail, and then everyone else fails as a result because you can't just live without women.
Right.
So there was a provision in the Civil Rights Act that was being debated to give women equal employment rights. And there was a conservative coalition in Congress that started in the as an opposition to the New Deal, and basically went up until I think it was like the 70s or something, late 60s maybe. It still existed at this time. It was a powerful force, and they could throw their weight around because on paper they're outvoted because the Democratic Party, which was civil rights favored the civil rights, had more people than the Republicans, which were supposed to be milquetoast on it. But in reality, congressional coalitions are a bit more different. So it's just something to look into there. In that provision, the conservative coalition had enough votes, had enough people against it to just scrap the whole thing. We didn't have to have equal employment rights for women. And a certain senator from Utah, if I remember correctly, Wallace F. Bennett, basically worked in a few compromises where the conservatives would give up the equal employment rights for women if they could get minor concessions elsewhere on race that were just done away with anyways in 4 years afterwards. So you can chalk this one up to incompetence, but it's real strange how stuff like this keeps happening. Just one other example. Jump to the 80s. The Mormons are one of the last actually segregated institutions in the United States. So, actually doing something traditional here, something less subversive than usual. Or perhaps you can make the case that they're kind of like our elite today, where they just segregation for me but not for thee. One or the other here. I'll let you pick. It depends on how charitable you're being. They get a lot of flack from the NAACP, the National Association, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they get a lot of flack from them. They're very discriminatory towards blacks. And the Reagan administration basically meets with the president and advises him to loosen your segregational stance here. Like, it's one of the last forces in American society to hold up on this. The Reagan administration pressures them to get let up, and then magically the next day, revelation from God: segregation is wrong. Okay.
It sounds like over time they take their orders from just the government. Is that a fair interpretation?
It's not over time. It's just sporadically they do. If the government ever tells them to stop doing something, they stop doing it. So, whenever you have agencies like the CIA and the FBI, they need people that they know will be aligned with them, be aligned with the American government, that will be generally high IQ, won't need to have as much of a background check, people that are typically more naive about the goings-ons of things, and people that ideally know things like languages or have connections. My God, what group in the United States could possibly fit this group for the FBI and the CIA?
Which is interesting because, as we have outlined, that they place their outlook of divinity right on the American government, if we believe that America is divinely ordained, as is the Constitution.
Yeah. This is a divine calling for them. When the FBI and the CIA... And here's the thing. The FBI and the CIA do not publish religious demographics, at least to where I can find them. So I cannot throw up like a pie chart that conclusively says the majority of the CIA or the FBI or a plurality are Mormon. What I can tell you is what the CIA and the FBI themselves say. They say they specifically try to target Mormon communities for hiring for anything that the CIA or the FBI do at any level. Because, at least for their stated outward reasons, they are cheaper to run background checks on. They fit all the things they need. They're clean. They know languages. They're higher IQ. They're less likely to be a liability. And they're the perfect population that will just trust the American government. So...
Can you imagine someone who's never even seen a bottle of whiskey kneeling before a Fed?
So, this is sort of like and I would be surprised if they make the upper management in the FBI or the CIA. I doubt they're the ones calling the shots. But they make for perfect people in the middle and the bottom. They will follow what they need to do. They will believe the lies, and they will justify the lies. They're the midwits and the lower end, if you will, if you're to use the bell curve thing. And so that's the FBI and the CIA point. And so whenever you see a lot of the feds trying to shut down more right-wing extreme stuff, the Mormons are just perfectly aligned with the federal government, and there's guaranteed to be at least one or two crawling in the woodwork there.
Now, I wonder...
overrepresented. It's a zealous mission for them.
I was going to ask, if we took everything that we just summarized and said it to a Mormon, do you think they would disagree or have any knee-jerk reaction against that?
If you took out my very biased against them language, it's just what they readily accept. Like, you can go and Google right now, I welcome you, FBI and CIA Mormon recruitment. You will get 2 articles come up that say why the FBI and CIA recruit from Mormons, and they will tell you exactly what I just said. And the Mormons wear it as a badge of pride. Right. They're protecting you. They're serving your security. They are helping you. It's a zealous mission for them, and they will own it.
And it's even on Today I Learned on Reddit. I'm looking at like a bunch of articles right now, but like it is kind of a known thing. Mm-hmm. Which I didn't know, but like it makes perfect sense because I'd never broken it. If someone had told that to me, I've been like, I don't know, maybe. But it makes like, why wouldn't they? And why wouldn't they be the most enthusiastic against any sort of dissidence against the American institution? Now, I wonder, and maybe we're not Mormons, so maybe we don't know. Do you think there's any sense within the Mormon community that America has changed or has betrayed its old values, or is it whatever's being done is good?
The average Mormon, at least the ones outside of Utah, because I've not set foot in Utah for potentially obvious reasons, the ones outside of Utah are obviously, if you look at your statistics and all that, they tend to be more right-leaning, quote-unquote. They've basically reached the point where they've lived in the desert long enough, the older generations have passed. The right-leaning position for a Mormon woman is to look traditional, sometimes acquiesce to your husband, but also you need to believe in, like, basically milquetoast feminism. And then, they'll talk about the Constitution and the great words of Jefferson and Washington and all this other stuff, and they'll look highly upon these Freemasonic deists for some reason. I have no clue why the Mormons would be attracted to them, but they'll have dissatisfaction when you get a Roman Catholic, quote unquote, like Joseph Biden in office, pushing a very degenerate left-wing agenda, they'll basically look for all of the wrong reasons for why this is happening and why the government is betraying them. So it's a papist coup in America, you see, because the Supreme Court is Catholic, Biden is Catholic. This wasn't meant to be a Catholic country. It was supposed to be Protestants and whites, which Mormons apparently are both Protestant and white now and not some sort of separate ethno-religious group. So
well, that's kind of what I was thinking of too, because even some people in our political sphere, they will look at Mormons just from the outside and say, "Oh, look, here's a bunch of trad whites."
Oh, yeah. And we'll do the same thing with the Anabaptists and just ignore all the faults. Like, you'll see based Amish posting, and we'll ignore like the pedophilia scandals that get covered up there. Like worse than like so. Any Roman Catholic knows that the media backlash for the pedophilic scandals were way overblown. It existed, sure, way overstated. The Amish have absolutely nothing going on against them. The Mormons, and this is what originally the other thing that brought me against them. They have a history. I used to have a 300-page document of instances, basically one instance per page, going back to 1959, starting in Oklahoma City with the Mormon bishop there, of the Mormon Church themselves, the higher-ups, covering up pedophilia. 300 pages, going back 60 years. And I think 2 of those cases ended up with someone going to jail out of the 300 pages in there. And I wonder if it has something to do with them being very comfy with the CIA and the FBI. But so
that's interesting.
The Mormons have something similar here, and we basically it's very easy to look at them and see, they're whites. They have a nice in-group preference. They're Christian, asterisk. And they really don't like outsiders. They've managed to keep their state from being ethnically displaced. They must be our guys. And, like, on the surface, I'm sure this makes perfect sense, but you look into them and they are most assuredly not your guys. They are the feds.
Yeah, they I hate to come back to this, but it's like, yeah, they worship the government.
Yeah, like, and this isn't some libertarian, like, hyperbole, they worship the government. They believe the government is divinely inspired.
I wonder, so you said your current girlfriend is maybe what we call a reformed Mormon, I suppose.
Ex-Mormon, I believe, is the phrase that usually gets thrown out.
So is she kind of open about, sharing? I don't know how big she was into it, but does she got the insider track on things? And because I'm wondering what they thought of someone like Trump as well.
So I like have dinners with her family and all that, so it's not like I don't know this stuff myself, but she usually stays quiet on a lot of political issues and acquiesces to me usually. Make of that what you will, but so they typically like Trump, and they'll give like the typical sort of normie con. Oh, he's a terrible person, and he's probably going to burn in hell, and like he's totally immoral. I can only support him because the opposition is worse. Is typically the things that I hear. And sometimes, like, you'll get based Mormon man that will come out and say that, like, Trump is a good. But,
yeah, because I'm curious about any, and again, this might be too much detail to ask, but I'm curious about any sort of internal strife within the Mormon community. Like, there seem to be so many different breakaway sects, and, like, how are they becoming more or less, feddy over time?
Breakaway sects. We talked about the Woolyites, which were sort of like the polygamous people that fled south of the border into like their really weird militant compounds. You had it was called like the Fundamental Mormon Church that fled up into the Western Territories of Canada that also kept practicing polygamy. So they were up there as well. In the modern day, they are being subverted from the left. Their main university, BYU, so the way they've always ran that university is they will have moles placed in classrooms that the university pays to basically rat out Mormon heresies against Mormonism. They will like secretly report you as like a secret university police, which some people will knee-jerkingly say based, but like these are feds. You have to keep that in mind. These are feds. It does not matter how base the method looks. It is against people that would do good. But in this case, they have issues because they excommunicated 7 people, I think it was in the 90s or the 2000s, might even be slightly earlier, because they were trying to make Mormons accept and tolerate, gays and lesbianism and all this other stuff, and slightly more atheistic interpretations of Mormonism. and that got a lot of media attention. It caused a controversy in their church. It caused people threatened to break away. And they basically put a lid on that. But now it's basically they're just slightly acquiescing piecemeal concessions to the left as time goes on. So they basically have a stranglehold on the Boy Scouts of America. I don't know if you knew that.
I did not. I find that very interesting.
If you go to the Boy Scouts in Idaho, Nevada, Utah, areas around there, it's basically just a Mormon, not paramilitary because they don't actually do military, but whatever the non-violent equivalent of that would be. It's an arm of the Mormon Church, basically, and that's also where a lot of their pedophilic scandals got covered up, was the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts, or rather the Scouts, sorry, it shouldn't be news how far to the left they've gone, and the Mormons still participate in it. So,
I never considered that before either. And I was thinking this might be me reaching a bit, but I'm going to say it anyway. That with Mormonism being a uniquely American religion, a lot of what we're saying reminds me of Scientology as well, which we wouldn't call a religion, but this adoption of like secret police, of, focuses on subversive ideas rather. And it makes me think that any religion that is invented within America cannot help but put the American government at the center, either for or against. So it's either that's the ultimate enemy, or but it's something that is so relevant that you almost have to end up adopting Fed-like tactics, as if that is like their holy spirit in a way. Right.
So I'm going to take that with the broadest interpretation possible and just assume that like the structure was founded in America, not like they came up with something totally new.
Yeah.
We mentioned earlier the LCMS, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. They were Lutherans that fled the Prussian Union in Germany. Saxons and Silesians, and they've basically ended up in St. Louis, or what was New Bremen at the time. Spoke German until like 1907. Most of the Midwest in the U.S. spoke German. It used to be the second most spoken language in the U.S. up until World War I. I don't know if you knew that.
No.
We used to be a patchwork of languages from the European continent. German got eradicated, but we can't do that to Spanish today. Anyways, that's just me seething. But,
hey, we're allowed to cope here. Is a cope-friendly cast.
Right. But just to make the point here, those German communities barely acknowledged the American government until like Prohibition happened. So it does exist, but they're the exception, definitely. You're right for the most part. The Mormons take it a step further, though. Instead of implicitly making the U.S. government the arbiter of good and evil, or the arm of Satan, they literally just say the U.S. government and its documents were divinely inspired, which it's going a bit farther. And then you see that in their politicians. We mentioned Mitt Romney earlier, and we'll get to his father in a second. He tried to run as the good, common-sense conservative candidate in 2012. And I'm sure he would have been leagues less subversive than Saul Alinsky-educated Obama. But he, as I'm sure if you were to go back and read about now or re-listen, he just completely flopped. He accepted the left-wing frame on everything. And why is that? Because the left-wing frame in 2012 was extolling the virtues of the U.S. government and its interventions. So Romney, I believe, was it he the governor of Massachusetts? Was it? Or was that just where I believe it was a lot of policy in Massachusetts. But Romney Care was his main thing.
Yeah, Michigan?
Michigan, was it?
I'm just looking up his fucking Wikipedia right now. Hold on.
Romney Care. Let's just search Romney Care.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Massachusetts, yeah, okay. So, Massachusetts. Romney Care, good common sense conservative, he opposed the democratic socialistic drive to just universalize healthcare, which is why what we need to do is provide something of substance in return. We need to give watered down socialized leftist healthcare to the United States that would completely screw up everything, but it's from the right. And for some reason, the GOP fell for this, and he screwed over Ron Paul and a bunch of other.
Because I was politically active back then. And I would watch it. I watched it pretty closely, that election, and I recall a lot of people on the right were saying that here's a trad guy. Look, big family, and they wouldn't say white family essentially. But then I remember looking at his career, And this wasn't as big of a talking point as I thought it would be, but his career was essentially corporate takeovers.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's an odd thing for such a alleged devout Christian guy to be into, like asset stripping corporations. I think that's what it was. So I'm like buying up things and like stripping them and quote making them profitable. And I think they kind of spun that. They focused a lot on him having a dog tied to the top of a car or some bullshit.
Yeah.
Like, you guys are kind of glossing over all this other stuff that stands out to me.
Yeah. And the other thing is as well, like, obviously he's a politician, so he's going to be a special breed of Mormon, but even then, just consider this. His father, if I remember correctly, and you can check me on this as we speak, just to make sure I do not lie and, like, over-exaggerate this, his father was born in a Mormon colony in Mexico.
I remember hearing that. I remember that they thought, and I think they were trying to run sort of an Obama thing, but they couldn't because it would seem hypocritical. But I think they actually wanted to be like, Mitt Romney's not even American, but they had their hands tied there.
Right, yeah. So, and that's not me trying to make some, he has to be born here, otherwise he's not a true red-blooded American. That's me saying, this is how strange the cult is.
Yes, he was born in Chihuahua, Mexico. So funny there's a fucking place called that. Anyway, yeah, he was born in Mexico, George W. Romney.
So, yeah, that's just, that's what you're working with here. Those are the people that are in your government that have such an extreme sway over the feds, and the State Department to a lesser extent for the same reasons. All these government agencies, the same logic applies. Hire a Mormon. They'll believe what we tell them. And, we don't have to run as many background checks, and they're much more reliable and higher IQ.
Let me also say that his father here was the third United States Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. They just got a fucking Mexican Mormon in to do that. That is extremely funny to me.
Yeah. I mean, so that's the whole spiel. Like I said, no concrete direct quotes from the Mormons saying we're going to subvert the United States and destroy what they like and the native population there. But you're not going to find that with literally anything else that we harp on either, except for maybe some overzealous Semites, shall we say. But
I was going to say, and again, let me know if this is too nuanced of a question, I suppose, but, it is... Is it fair to say that they're mostly harmless? And what I mean by that is that we have clear proof that the federal agencies love kind of putting their hands on the scales of everything they do and maybe corrupting Mormons. Is it a two-way street? Is there anything about Mormons that feeds back into the system that makes it worse, do you think?
Right. So
maybe it is just an overall treacherousness, but if there's anything else.
Well... Okay, so just the broad, mostly harmless thing. I mean, I'm sure they're mostly harmless until they're like the thralls knocking on your door, not knocking on your door and arresting you. But I don't know if we were to remove Mormonism, I don't know if things would get better or worse. I'm sure there would be, the FBI and the CIA would be starved of a lot of their high IQ and blindly loyal administrators and thralls and all this other stuff. So that would be a good positive. And, of course, the political sort of block or influence or sway, I don't want to say block because they're not like an actual coalition in Congress, but they usually take up the high-ranking positions of the Congress. And, sorry, I'm just coming to the realization, Wallace F. Bennett, I believe, was Arizona, not Utah. But, so, they're in the surrounding areas. They have a lot of sway. They usually become the senior statesman. They usually end up guiding the GOP is what usually happens. Hilariously, like it's an organized minority, not to use, buzzwords. It's an organized minority that can take over a mass of people that just are god-awful at organizing. So that's just what happens with the Mormons. And having articulated that, I suppose we could say that, yes, the Mormons existing as a factor do make things worse in some capacity. Obviously, I can't measure it.
Well, what's interesting is now that you've been talking about this, I've been reading an article I just had in front of me on Mormonism, and I totally forgot this figure. It was Glenn Beck. He's a Mormon, isn't he?
Is he really? Hold on. Am I thinking of the right person?
It's the that old Fox News host.
I didn't realize.
I remember him when he was hired. I think that was part of his thing. So he was bringing two things to the table: the sort of born again Christianity. I think it was Mormonism, but then also like one of the first big guys who was leading the charge on that American libertarianism stuff, Tea Party stuff.
Right.
And he's still relevant as far as like he runs, I think it's the Blaze. So I think he's an interesting case study. Let me just, am I lying right now? Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can, it says here, but what site? It's Business Insider. So I know this whole fucking article here seems like it's written by a Mormon too. I'm on businessinsider.com. It's like 11 things you didn't know. I was going to say 11 things you didn't know about Mormonism. And then this one down here is like, did you know that modern day Mormon prophets relay God's messages to the faithful? I'm like, that's not a fun fact. What the fuck is this? Anyway, sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier Scientology kind of having similarities. Mormons will just completely rewrite stuff. They will rewrite history books. They will rewrite websites. That 300-page document that I was telling you about earlier, it was originally from a website called Restore Our Dignity. Because it was people that had been molested as children by Mormon priests and bishops. And they were basically just compiling the whole history of it, the whole 300 pages of basically unprosecuted crimes. Or settled. And you know how settling works in the United States justice system. It's basically just like, you're too important for us to imprison, so just pay some money. They got taken down by the LDS. If you go to their website now, it's basically gone because the LDS filed a lawsuit and they basically could not keep up with the legal fees. So I'm sure if you try the Wayback Machine, you can probably find it. I can't find it anymore, and I have it saved on one of my older computers. So
it's fascinating that so many modern religions, and maybe we can even include Catholicism and others, seem to pride themselves on existing apart from governments, apart from the state. And only in a few unique cases do we have these organizations running towards the state. And I'm interested in that as almost a survival tactic. But again, if you're doing an about face on so many of your principles, like what is the point? Like, are you maintaining anything, or is it at the end of the day, have you changed so much from what Mormonism was that all you have left is polygamy? Maybe that's it. I don't know.
Could you rephrase that perhaps? Because I think I might be able to address that maybe differently.
Oh, well, I was going to say that it's interesting that, you know, as Mormonism and maybe I'm trying to think of another religion, like maybe Scientology, like it adopts litigiousness so easily, whereas other religions wouldn't want to be so litigious and play to the media and play to the state, and other religions seem to exist outside of the state or seem to serve something higher. But I'm wondering if, what was the point I was trying to make? It was about like if what we said is that Mormonism over time seems to betray its principles. Like it goes to the government and then betrays its friend, betrays its enemies, and becomes like, what is it really conserving anymore? As like, what is Mormonism anymore? Other than just people who are kind of, or other than just polygamy, maybe.
And this is assuming though that it had the stated principles we were originally given were genuine.
Yeah.
Joseph Smith was about to be convicted as a con artist, I would like to remind you. So, you know, the typical stereotype is that this is just a religion for Joseph Smith to just get set up for life as a egotistical and well-paid prophet. Seems convincing to me, to be quite honest. This is one of the times where the stereotype just seems to be completely true. The guy jumped trial in upstate New York, saw Old Egyptian, the language that has never existed, on golden tablets in the middle of a field without any witnesses and without any sort of proof, and went to the most gullible group of people in the United States at the time after the Second Great Awakening and told them, guys, I'm going to restore the true Christian church. Let's go screw things up.
Yeah.
So
I just want to say, I don't want to offend any Mormons who are listening, but if there is any Mormons listening, but I just want to say that it does have very much of a we was Kang's flavor to it. Like I found we were the original Egyptians, and I found Egyptian, it's a lot of poorly misunderstood Egyptian stuff.
Right. And there's a little bit, I'm going to get a lot of flack from this for anyone that's Mormon. This is not very favorable to them, but that's just the way it is. So, so their principle from the beginning, I would argue, is literally just pragmatism for whoever is running it. Which makes perfect sense why they act the way they do then, and why they were so easy to adopt polygamy and then just scrap it, supposedly by revelation from God.
Now, I also have a question. If this is too personal, feel free to say so, but it's very interesting that you have, again, sort of the inside track through your girlfriend, and I was wondering if this has ever come up at these dinners you attend with her family, or there been any debates or anything like that.
They usually shy away from religious discussion, just because. And I was told by them, and I was literally told by them they did not want to argue with me, just for the simple reason that they knew that I was a better arguer, and there's nothing
Nice.
productive that they thought could come from that. So,
Man, that's pretty cool. That's a nice flex you got there.
well, I mean, it makes things easier for me because that would be a very awkward dinner table conversation.
Well, also, you seem like a very like serious and well put together guy. So I can't imagine you like
Oh, thank
throwing
you.
plates of fucking spaghetti at the wall, which is what I would do and have done and will do again. But
I mean,
I have a similar
I
experience with my
can
in-laws too.
I can lose my temper, but yeah, you're right. I don't cause physical damage or harm or anything like that. I usually just raise my voice, and yeah, there are a couple of arguments where I'll get tearful. Either there was one I got in a 6-hour argument with a Southern Baptist about eschatology, and by the end of it, like my throat was bleeding and my eyes were tearing because it was painful to keep going, and I was too prideful to stop. Like, I'm not going to lose the point here. Are you kidding me? I've been doing this since noon, and it's 6 p.m.
That
But
is that's awesome.
and then there are other things where it gets a little bit more emotionalistic, where I can't help but have like a couple of tears. Like, I'm not crying or bawling or like being effeminate. Like, it's just like I've been yelling or something like that for so long that like it's just a natural response for tears to generate. So
I'm in the same situation when I speak to my in-laws. I'll have to take a moment, bite my fist, single tear runs through my eye, and I'll look at them and I'll go, LOL, LMAO even.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
it's the same thing, and honestly, it's common enough. Like, especially the longer you're with someone. I don't know how long you've been with this girl. She sounds good though. Good.
sophomore year of high school, so about 4 years.
No, the hard part's over. Honestly, this shit gets easier as you go. If you made it past the first couple of years, unless there's some like crazy shit that happens, like
Oh, cool.
she challenges you to a duel by accident, then you have to duel, but you don't know the dueling rules. You don't know that you're supposed to politely aim up. So you're both thinking, I have to aim.
I can't just deny a duel. I have honor.
Yeah, exactly. What are you, a Mormon? So you gotta fucking. It's
man.
funny though that I have the same thing with my in-laws where they're basic bitch liberals. So in a sense, when you have an entity like that, you can essentially predict what they're going to say on any given topic. And my father-in-law, he's a nice guy, but he's what you would call a midwit. I say that with as much affection as possible. So he thinks that like reading the headlines on like CNN, it's just the headlines. He won't read the article. He'll just read the headlines and say, "Yep, I got the news for the day." And I just have to bite my lip. I'm like, even people who just read CNN know that's dumb. That's a dumb thing to say. But that means I know that on any given topic, he doesn't really know much.
Right.
And he's a Canadian, so he like loves Trudeau, which is a weird thing to like. Like even people who
Did he
like
did he like the Elder Trudeau?
Well, that's interesting.
I know that one's a bit different because like a lot of people liked him, but
yeah, and I don't. And anyone who knows Canadian history kind of gets that. He probably has not. And this is all it's speculation, but it's as good as the truth because it's a liberal. They will kind of just stay with what they learned in high school. And what you learned in high school was that he stood up to Quebec, and that's cool and badass in the same way Joe Biden is cool and badass for wearing aviators. So it's very just, this sounds like a TV show, cool thing, mic drop.
War Measures Act, and then he stood up to the Queen, and we get a nice red flag now, which just happens to be the Liberal Party colors,
Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, "Kiss my ass." Yes, Queen. Just like shit you see on like a sizzle reel. So, but in that sense, I can't even get mad because I'm like, oh, you just don't know anything. But
it's like I can't like find there are libertarians in the US that will like seethe with anger when someone like says something positive about Lincoln. For me, it's just a chore. Like I will sigh, but it's not because I'm like angry. It's just because like it's someone, if it's like someone I care about, someone to work on now. Just because the only thing you get taught about Lincoln in school is good guy, but or maybe slightly bad because didn't like dislike slavery enough.
Yeah, and they do weird copes like, he was elected president because people wanted to free the slaves, and like that is so far away from what. And the thing is, what I find, the way to talk to these people that I found is to show them that the truth is more exciting than the liberal fiction that they've been taught. And
Yeah,
sometimes that doesn't work, but like I always give the example of my mom. And I got some, like we said, we're at an advanced level of political autism with a lot of things. So I always
yeah,
challenge myself, and this is a marketing thing, but I'm like, I need to be able to explain this to my mother. And if I can explain this to my mother, who's a lovely woman, but I won't go, whatever. She's kind of hard. She's a real pill sometimes. But,
I see.
and she doesn't watch the news, doesn't know nothing. But if I can explain an idea to her, that means I understand it as well as I can. And also, she's a good barometer for the average person. So
Right. Yes.
I can convince her. I'll tell her the truth. She's like, "Oh, really?" I'm like, I gotcha."
Right, and we mentioned at the outset, we kind of quipped about elite theory being beaten to death. Um, I do have to admit, the lazy impulse in me is very happy to embrace elite theory because it makes sure that I just don't have to care about shit libs.
Yeah, I mean, because I think elite theory has a lot of explanatory power. I think just some people, the big divide seems to be, and I would, some people get mad at me for saying this, but I hear a lot of post leftism in a lot of the cathedral stuff, and I hear a lot of that sort of Marxist philosophy behind the claims that ideology is all a spook, and that we spoke to a guy you're probably aware of named Tyler Hamilton, Thamester Whitnat, who's big into phenomenology, and he pushes back on a lot of the NRX stuff about this. All you need to care is how power. It's almost like a materialist. It's like a psychological materialist way of looking at the world, where all anyone cares about is self-interested power, and it cloaks itself in a thin veneer of ideology. And I hear a lot of that, and I'm like, I'm not sure. Sorry, I think I cut you off there.
No, I was just going to say Sandbach, Christopher Sandbach is really good on that, and one of the things that originally drew me to paying attention to him was he's basically just saying like half of the dissident right is post-leftism dressed up to look really right-wing and traditional. And I was like, whoa.
He's right on a lot of that. And people, I think people are correct in calling out some of the more nefarious aspects of Duginism and anti-Americanism. And this is what I liked about the Sandbaches of the world out there, where they're like, really take a closer look at how much anti-Americanism you just accept. Is it possible that this is some sort of propagandized event from a foreign actor who you really don't want in charge either?
Right, yeah. And so a really good contrast to someone that is against the U.S. like government's actions, but not an anti-American, would be Mr. Stephen Carson that we mentioned earlier. Just because he will say he's against empire for the main reason that it is bad for the people doing the empire, regardless of whether we believe that. That is very much different from the sort of Duginist, we are against the empire from the U.S. because it's Western.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's those evil white Western Europeans trying to enforce their culture on my mother Russia. Things like that.
Yeah, and I think, I hate, calling people. I try not to call anyone out, really, because I don't really disagree that much. I think some people are wrong on some points on some things, but I rarely think someone's 100% wrong about everything. But I think a lot of people have a confused read on the Russia-Ukraine situation. What does this mean for white nationalists? I'm like, it literally doesn't actually mean anything if you really unpack it. And I find that the people I like are correctly saying be cautious about the ideological traps that exist when you're trying to pick a side here.
I remember back in February, I directly said, I am not going to follow this or pick a side or do any damn thing about it. And that's just going to be my fence-sitting neutral position because it's not my issue and I'm not going to be able to find a winning position with this. and I've just maintained that evil fence-sitting neutrality.
Well, I think the most recent one was, and again, I recommend people look into this stuff themselves. Is the recent debate? I believe Joel Davis hosted it with
Yep.
Greg Johnson and Mark Collette, two people I like both of them. I have great affection for them, but I wasn't thrilled with either of their positions in the debate. And if I could summarize them briefly, it would be Greg Johnson he's a white nationalist, so he was pro-Ukraine because Ukraine is sort of an ethnic nationalist, avatar in that part of the world. So they're fighting the fight we're fighting. Whereas Mark Collette was essentially saying the enemy of my enemy is my friend, saying that, be that as it may, the driving enemy, our largest enemy, existential enemy, is the American empire. They're exporting gay stuff, trans stuff, anti-white stuff. And I'm like, well, you're both kind of right. That this is the problem. I'm like, I get where you're both coming from, but I'm not thrilled with the reductive nature of either of these, because I don't really buy into the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I'm not willing to become a Russia cheerleader just because I've got as a Canadian, a vassal state of America. That is what we are. I'm not thrilled with it, but I'm like, we saw this a few years ago when people were going on about based China. And I'm like, you got the wrong read on China, man.
Tell that to someone that lives in like Vancouver or British Columbia.
Well, fuck, my co-host, Judas, these would have been older episodes, but he used to live in Hong Kong. And he's got fantastic insight on the inner workings of being in China, what the Chinese government is like on the ground, existing there. And Hong Kong is sort of a satellite area to the mainland China, but he did business directly with mainland China. And he was there during those student protests. And we had on the ground coverage of what that was like. And, he's got the, most detailed read on like what China's act. He's like, you got no idea. And he's like, as much as we talk about, of feds and stuff, he's like, he said that he saw people being black bagged and thrown in the back of a van in the middle of the day every single day.
Yeah, sounds about right.
And he had a theory that I kind of believe, and he had some evidence to back it up, but he's like, a lot of the COVID deaths were just a cover for them disappearing political dissidents because, they were getting rid of some inconvenient Hong Kongers, mainland China.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that sounds plausible to me. But yeah, once I tend to follow, to the chagrin of like people like my good friend Paul Fahrenheit, I tend to follow Mr. Carson's perspective of being an isolationist. He tends to keep up much better than I do with foreign events and the goings-on of the empire, but I typically try not to get involved in any of it, even intellectually, just because the only thing that I'm ever going to say is that unless we are like threatened or something, like we shouldn't be there, which means that whenever we have news saying we are there and we're doing these terrible things, or we're helping this government or the other government's doing terrible things, it's just going to be, that's how it operates. Like, I have nothing to add.
Well, that's the thing. A lot of people have some opinions of what third positionism really is and whether or not it's, the third position to me, Dimes, is, showing up to a debate, two sides, and saying, in a lot of ways, it's a very difficult situation.
We need to add some nuance to the discussion here.
It's showing up and taking a position that enrages and confuses everybody.
I mean, that's pretty base, though. Like, that's the what's the meme? Shows up, refuses to elaborate, leaves. Yeah,
shows up. I see it from both sides, and in a lot of ways, we're both right, but in a lot of ways, we both got the wrong read on this, man. Then I leave and go get a bag of lollipops. That's my praxis.
That's a pretty based way of going about life, if you ask me.
Let's get back to the simple stuff. We want to own the libs. We want a wife who's not like totally subservient, but talks less than what's mainly on the market. And I think, look, honestly, if any of us can get a fucking house in this market, I think that's going to be enough.
Yeah. I mean, I've been looking at the average house price just soaring, And, it occurred to me that once upon a time, people my age had aspirations to own property by their own merit. Like,
Listen to my grandparents talk about what they paid for a house. I look them in the eyes and say, I'm going to shoot you in the chest if you tell me that you paid 50 grand for your 3-bedroom house.
yeah. Like, oh, I worked minimum wage. My wife was at home with the children. I have a nice, like, 3-bedroom house with nice land by the river and a hunting range. I just,
You should just pull
God.
yourself up by the bootstraps. I don't have bootstraps. I have gay shackles.
So, and the common talking point that pull yourself up by your bootstraps is meant to be facetious, but at the very least, with the elderly and the aged that I do know, they have not told me to just do it myself. They have like a sense of community, which is good. It makes me see the lot less deep down.
It is, yeah. And back to where, and we'll get going soon because I know I have to get going to bed. She's wife's in bed and she's like, "Oh, you're
Yeah, I see.
podcasting again." But
Yeah.
it is a point that with the millennials, I know that in my family, I think I'm the first member in many generations that actually wants to maintain a close proximity to my immediate family. A lot of my aunts, uncles, everyone moves away with Gen X and boomers. That was kind of the thing they encouraged, even spread out. But this idea of having
Right.
even toying with the idea of having a multi-generational household. Like I swear to God, it's only millennials who are toying with this idea, homesteading, all that stuff. Like this
Yeah.
is, you have to go back 5 generations before you find someone in my family who would even thought that was a good idea. They're all fucking shit libs, but I'm like, it's kind of uncharted territory, but that's exciting in a way.
Yeah. I mean, if everything is so drastically changed to where all you have to do is open up a history book or a storybook and see something radically, quote unquote, new in there, that's paradigm shifting, like homesteading. Like, I mean, all the better for us. Like, we don't even have to come up with it. It's just there. We can go do it. It gives us exactly what we want, and it's probably going to be our next elite, I believe, is what Charlemagne was saying. I'm not going to take credit for such an astute point of him, but like your next elites are going to be the people that have the capability to successfully homestead.
Yeah, I think Charlemagne, I read that post and it was very, very insightful. And I liked it a lot where he said, like, and I'm kind of working this into an article I'm going to write soon, but it's like the types of people who are talking about what might even sound like a peasant lifestyle, like they're the aristocracy, they're the vanguardists. And so, and every homesteader you see with a YouTube channel or whatever, they do have a very dissident, vanguardist, very almost heroic outlook, which is completely alien to the types of person who would be doing that in the past. And I found that framing of it so interesting.
Yeah, and so this is obviously an extremely long-term plan. The people that are your homesteaders are going to be your next elites. I like the potential veiled implication there that literally everyone else will be taken down if you don't go and homestead and save yourself.
Yeah.
Kind of like the prophets in Old Testament Israel, basically telling them your judgment is coming. Get the hell out of here, repent or accept it.
Yeah.
The prophet Jeremiah.
And there's a lot of people in our scene who are asking these questions and are actually planning this. And I'm sure we've talked to a lot of them too, like very, very young enough guys, but they're driven and they're building networks because the idea of homesteading and removing yourself from civilization. That's what one thing I warn people about. Like, no. What you're actually doing is creating sort of almost a parallel mutual aid network. And this is, before we go, I'll just say that this is what you see with a lot of homeschooling too, because I speak to a lot of homeschooling advocates. Maybe not even on like the far right, but it usually filters for conservatives at least. But like the way they do it is they've got this extended, peer network of other homeschooling people, and that's how they do it. And they figured out a way. And I'm like, okay, well, that makes more sense now. Now I'm getting an organizational structure of how this will work, and I think the types of people who are doing this. Like I always talk about Owen Benjamin. He's kind of an interesting case study, but I'm like, yeah, he's the type of mind who would do homesteading, like a weird fucking comedian, and like he's got the moon isn't real, sure, whatever, but he's like the people who are on the fringes of thought are also the ones who are taking this pioneer spirit. I'm like, well, that's something. That's something I'm excited about.
And that's how it's always been. Like, if you look back at American colonization, the people to come over here were either like the crazy businessmen in like the Virginia Charter, thought it would be very profitable and rich, or Puritans that were like so on the fringe of the Anglican Church that they thought it was better for their long-term health and the will of God for them to move continents across the ocean to go to the wilderness to like face the red men and like God's terrifying wilderness. Like, it's always been this way, at least for the Americans. Like, I'm sure Canada probably has a similar history, but I'm not as well versed. I just know that like there was an Avalon colony and it got burnt down, and then eventually all the colonies were combined into a confederation.
I think like the founding of Canada is a great case study in the true extremes of alcoholism. That I think
I was told it was founded over drinks.
Yeah,
so.
everyone here is drinking. Sir John A. Macdonald, our first prime minister, was a amazing fall down drunk and would just go in the woods, stumbling and come back with, a witch's head or something. But
I mean, that's pretty base.
Yeah, it is. I'm trying to bring that back. Anyway, I got to get going now. This has been an amazing talk, Mr. Turnipseed. Just to remind people, I can still see your Twitter. You're suspended, but I can still see
I am locked out, not suspended.
Okay.
So, sorry, I should be more precise if I said suspended. Locked out in particular is what's happened. I cannot access the account. It could be for 7 days, but I also know people that just get permanently banished to the Shadow Realm, so wouldn't count on it. I do have Telegram, though, which I'll stop interrupting you.
Oh, no, that's fine. Like, you have, I will say, people go to findmyfriends.net,
Yes.
FRENS. So if anything does change, I'm sure it'll be updated there. You have a Telegram. What is that? That's Turnips Digest on Telegram. Yep. We also have the YouTube channel for Ryan Turnipseed. Go there to find some videos. And it's all very good stuff. We mentioned a couple here. Have a look at some of the more recent ones. Very, very interesting stuff. And Mr. Turnipseed, thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And hopefully, perhaps on my channel one of these Saturday mornings, you could join me.
I'm absolutely open for that. I love that.
Epic. All righty.
All right.
Yeah, thank you for a pleasant evening.
I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Yeah, see ya.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.